Mr. Pop.
My heart left to wonder if you can hear it too. Oh, give me your all for just a moment. That wonderful sensation when it was you and me. Soon I will join you, you will see a kiss that I'll remember.
Good evening, Wastelanders. This is DJ Pony. It's that time of week to take a break from music to have a bit of a more personal interaction. A lot of you probably wonder why I arbitrarily set this night aside every 7 days for this little fireside chat. Well, the reason for that is that there was once a time when days of the week actually mattered. It was a concept that goes back thousands of years, almost to time immemorial. Back when ancient magic and order were first put into motion, there became 6 days of a week and a 7th where they rested. 6 days, 6 elements, together. A day they could bask in the glow of creation, which was appropriately named Sunday. And as society grew and the old kingdoms were replaced with new kingdoms, that Sunday remained something special. In the Golden Age, the days before the war, Sunday was a time when family and friends would come together, a day they would be at rest, sit, and talk with one another. This probably sounds sappy to most of you. It's an archaic concept belonging to a long-dead society. What purpose does it serve in post-apocalyptia? But the truths that concept was built on still survive to this day. I think there's something of value to hold on to there, which is why I like to keep programming the station by days of the week, as it used to be. Following the age-old rhythm, swinging to the oldies. Because a lot of you hear my voice, or whatever song is playing at the moment, but you don't get to see behind the scenes all that often. If you did, you'd have an idea of how often I'm reminded of the past. Just like so many robots ticking away out there in the wasteland, doing the last thing they were programmed to do, the radio is the same way. Once every hour, my transmitter performs an automated network test to see what stations are transmitting. Because most of the large old buildings still have a reactor keeping them going, there are a lot of signals to pass through. Most of these signals aren't actually broadcasting, as you can tell, but they are sending closed-circuit transmissions to other radio stations, called carrier signals, letting all the other stations know who's out there. When my transmitter runs that hourly test, I can hear all the carrier signals for all the old radio stations still playing. They are the voices that would have been spoken by each transmitter, if they had the strength to say anything at all. Those voices are what each station transmitted on that last day, the day the bombs fell and the world as we knew it ended. Their transmission is like a funeral dirge, the last words spoken by tens of thousands of ponies, bringing entertainment, or news, or personal accounts like this to millions of adoring listeners. Let me play you a sample of what I hear at this time every day.
Mr. Pop.
A bit haunting, isn't it? Every day, every hour, I hear these echoes of the past, these ghosts living on in the airwaves. I'm reminded that we're one of the few stations that are still here, still carrying on, bringing you entertainment, news, and personal accounts to each of you adoring listeners. Which is why I will go to any length to make sure that my broadcast is meaningful, and it does something good for all of you out there, just trying to get by in the wasteland. even if that means setting up another broadcasting station to do it. Come in, Amber. Do you read me?
This is Amber Horn at Offsite Broadcasting Station number 1. I can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic! We here at DJ Pony Studios would like to thank our friend Dr. Greenshift and all the ghouls of Dusselhoof. Because of their raw materials and horsepower, we have a brand new broadcasting location set up so that we can interview those ponies who would otherwise make 10 Pony Tower residents feel uncomfortable. How are you liking the new digs, Amber?
Well, considering I'm only here a few hours a week, I can't complain. It's nice getting out of the generator room once in a while.
I definitely appreciate the help, as always.
I've noticed you've been playing my episode quite a bit.
Well, of course. It's the latest one. Need to make sure everyone gets a chance to hear it.
You mean everyone gets a chance to hear the ending?
Yes, I do. Although I personally hope it isn't the ending.
That's fine. Play it all you want. They aren't listening. And even if they are, they don't care.
I really think you should reconsider. Give me more info. I could reach out.
Shouldn't you be introducing your other special guest? I must say, it's nice having a friendly face here with me.
Yes, it is. I wasn't sure if it was going to work out, since scheduling can be hectic in this line of work, but I thought it's something the audience might enjoy, because she's the mare that started all of this in the first place. Isn't that right?
Oh, just admit it. You missed hearing the sound of my voice.
I really did. That's why I made sure you got your own microphone. How are you doing, Battered Blade?
I've been doing well. Things are business as usual for Emerald and I. I wouldn't be able to run Battered's bodyguards without her. She's the best girl a mother could ask for.
I'm glad to hear that. Is she back at the Opera House?
Yeah, I just gone to town a few days ago. I like to check in on the Manhattan branch on a regular basis.
So Battered's bodyguards run people back and forth between New York and the Opera House?
We can take ponies other places as well, but that's the main, established route, yeah. The Opera House is close by this big turnpike where a bunch of other freeways and railroad tracks meet up.
I know where you're talking about. The first highway that leads to that junction. That's how I reached Manhattan originally, by walking the road that follows the shoreline.
Yeah, that's the coastal highway, the route we usually take. Wait, so you walked that road by yourself?
Well, yeah.
Damn, you're one tough mare. Why am I here again?
Well, because I don't want Amber to have to constantly be on alert or watching the door. No need to run a switchboard and hold a gun if she doesn't have to. Plus, I remember some pony complaining that she didn't get enough airtime on the first episode of Confessions of a Wasteland Pony.
I mean, I don't know. I would have talked more about Emerald or something. What's been going on in our lives since adopting her.
Well, I figured with the new arrangement of the off-site broadcasting station, we could also hear the occasional traffic report from you, what the safety is like for all those traveling the coastal highway, since you probably know it better than anyone.
Yeah, I could do that. I see so much crazy shit day to day. It'd be nice to not have to repeat myself so much with each escort.
Just admit it. You miss talking to me.
You know, there is a short story I can start off with. This just happened to me on the run last week.
Go ahead.
So, Emerald and I had just finished breakfast, and we were cleaning our guns, as everyone should, every morning. Always make sure your weapon is in good working order before going out into dangerous territory.
Is this going to turn into some kind of public service announcement?
Kinda. So, we're having breakfast when these two ponies walked in. One of them was a young mare, even younger than Amber here. But unlike Amber, she was a real waif. Didn't look like she'd seen a battle or gunfight in her whole life. The buck that walked in with her said they have some kind of job to do that's going to be really risky, and wanted the mare taken to her uncle's house in the city. Although she didn't say much at first, the girl was trying to fight him on it. She didn't want him to leave, but he looked like he was in a rush, and he kind of pushed her off his leg.
Clearly some tension going on.
It wasn't really her decision at all. He plopped down a big ammo container full of caps for payment, with like a 30% tip. He said to make sure she was safe, and walked off. Just like that, we were alone, and Emerald and I were just staring at this young mare that had been dropped on our doorstep. I asked her what her name was, and she sheepishly said, Daisy. I asked her who that buck was, and she said he was her father. Things seemed really off to me though, so I had to give her the talk. Daisy, are you being held against your will? Are your father or uncle keeping you captive for any reason? Have they hit you? Have they touched you?
Oh, goddess. Are those kind of questions necessary? Has that kind of thing happened before?
Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the first time. Certain gangs will try to use us like a trafficking operation, shuttling their property from one place to another. But that is not what we do. We are not slavers. We are bodyguards who use our skills and experience to help ponies and get them safely through dangerous areas in the wasteland. Because of my own past, I have a pretty good eye for this sort of thing. I can usually tell just from looking at this mare that something is going on. If things are fishy, we will take them to any number of different places. We keep a list of connections that can help us shelter these poor ponies whenever a gang tries to pull something like that. We've gone into firefights over it, but we saved a lot of ponies as well. By this point, most gangs have learned, but a few will still try to trick us.
That's just horrible.
Luckily, in this case, the situation wasn't like that. Once I asked her those questions, Daisy's shyness disappeared and she gave us more context. Apparently, she grew up in the small mountain town. Pretty much everyone in the town worked in mines digging out rare metals and other things they could trade. After her mom died, she became the homemaker. So, as I thought, she didn't really get out much. Then, a few weeks ago, a rumor reached the town about some huge motherlode of pre-war stuff that no one had reached yet. So, getting caught up in scavenger fever, pretty much the whole town packed up to travel to the location to claim it. But the motherlode was surrounded by dangerous territory, so they were sending the mare to her uncle's house, where the father could come home for her later.
Did you believe her?
Yeah, it wasn't the whole story. She sounded like she was trying to hide any details about this motherlode for the sake of her dad and the others. Make sure they were the ones to get to it first. But, after cross-examining her, I was pretty sure she wasn't being abused in any way. She was just this scared, shy mare, petrified to be out on her own in this scary wasteland.
Well, that's not as bad as it could have been.
No, it wasn't. And in a way, that's exactly what we're here for. I assured her that we were the best at what we did, and since I was heading to town anyway, I would take her myself. And just like that, we were on the road.
So, what are the benefits of traveling on the coastal highway?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's a nice, short, simple route. We travel between the shore and the small mountain range that follows it, so you bypass a lot of the problems that pop up on other highways leading into the city.
So, if it's safer, why do they need you in the first place?
It's safer than other highways because it isn't as much of a haven for gang activity. There aren't a lot of places to create any kind of permanent settlement, so the raiders that do pop up on the road are usually loners operating on their own. Like I was, a long time ago. In fact, one reason I chose the Opera House even back then was because it was near the old turnpike, right before the highway split off in different directions. Once you're on the coastal highway, you're bottled up between the mountains and water until you reach New York.
Interesting. I'd imagine a lot of ponies don't take the path for that reason.
A lot of ponies don't know about it, but like I said, the ones that do are aware of how any lone gunmen are out there, just waiting to prey on travelers. A long time ago, I promised myself that I would escort one pony safely through that corridor for each one that I had made a victim.
But if I recall, Emerald told me you already paid off that debt threefold.
Maybe, but I would never stop anyway. The journey is pretty simple. A normal trip only takes about 4 days of walking. Leaving at breakfast like we did, we would have been in the city by sunset on the 4th day.
But I'm guessing because you're telling the story, this didn't turn out to be a normal trip.
That's for damn sure. So it's pretty much expected that you'll bump into some pony on the highway, but it isn't always a threat. Occasionally, you'll just bump into a regular traveler or a small team, like a family. When that happens, we sometimes end up traveling with them, adding to the numbers to help keep an eye on each other. It usually isn't a problem because, not to brag, but I'm usually a good judge of character.
As you've stated twice now.
I'm just trying to make the point. Because one other type of character we run into on the road are couriers. Now, without mincing words, I don't like couriers. I think a lot of them end up in that job because they're a little messed up in the head. Like, they can be very distracted, or won't talk to ponies, or just be downright crazy. There are a few good ones, but most of them act like they've been shot in the head one too many times.
I think we get the idea.
So, on the 3rd day, we bumped into this courier at this resting place I sometimes stop at. Just like us, he was resting his hooves for 5 minutes and refilling his canteen from the small pond. Now, like I said before, I usually don't like couriers because they're a bunch of quiet sociopaths. But this guy was much different from the norm. In fact, he was a real chatterbox. Someone who'd probably do well on your show. Pretty much from the moment we walked up, he started talking to us. He wasn't a colt, but he wasn't also that seasoned either. He was probably in his mid-20s and looked kind of skittish to be out on the highway. Ironically, he was actually comforting for Daisy, who went right along with his conversation. She could pick up how uncomfortable he was to be on the road too, and they sort of bonded over that.
Interesting.
All 3 of us continued walking, and I mostly just listened to the 2 of them talk. When I'm escorting someone, I'm on the clock, and my number 1 priority is keeping them safe, so I was mainly keeping my eyes on him. He didn't exactly say what he was carrying, but he was very protective of his saddlebag. He kept it clutched tight and tapped it every once in a while to make sure whatever he was carrying was still in there. At the time, I figured he was still a young courier trying to prove his worth to whatever caravan he worked for, and wanted to make sure the assignment went off without a hitch. It wasn't until we set up camp that night that I had a change of heart.
Oh, really? He ended up showing his true colors?
Not exactly. He wasn't threatening to us. Quite the opposite, actually. At the campfire, he admitted that he was glad he bumped into us, because he was afraid he'd run into some creature called the Red Reaper.
The Red Reaper?
Yeah. He made it sound almost like an urban legend. The ghost of some dead buck that was hunting couriers, seeking out the one who had killed him or something like that. Kind of a standard fireside ghost story. But then, he mentioned that he had seen the buck a few days ago and had just barely gotten away. This wasn't a ghost story anymore. This courier was being targeted by someone, and now we had stepped into the crosshairs with him. Well, shit, I said to myself. I have to get Daisy away from here before this Red Reaper character catches up to him. As soon as the courier fell asleep, I shook Daisy awake, and we quickly packed up our stuff. But as we were tying up the last saddlebag, I heard a twig snap.
It's always trouble when the ghost story comes to life.
Naturally, I whipped my sword out with magic and had my assault rifle shouldered. At this point, Daisy was scared and was covering her mouth to keep from screaming or crying. I scanned around the area I had heard the sound. We had set up camp under a highway overpass where the coastal road passed over a small forest with lots of hills. There were still a lot of petrified trees all around us, so I was looking over all of them while keeping Daisy close behind me. That's when we heard the courier yell and turned back around to the campfire. The courier had been pulled out of his small tent and was being held tight in the left arm of a large armored buck. While he wasn't a ghost, like the courier had said, he definitely lived up to his name of the Red Reaper. The buck that stood before us was fairly tall and slender. I suppose it could have been a skeleton inside, or more likely a ghoul. He was wearing a strange kind of armor I had never seen before. The chest piece was made out of matte black metal plates, but had white hoses circling around to the sides, making it look like a rib cage. Two of the hoses near the top were connected to a gas mask, which made up part of the helmet he was wearing. On that helmet were two glowing crimson eye panels. I couldn't see what was behind them.
If there was anything behind them, it could have been a robot.
If it was, then that thing knew how to dress the part. On top of all that, the Red Reaper wore a long black cloak that covered most of its body and had a hood that draped over his head, so the crimson red eyes stared out from the black abyss. Only the muzzle of the gas mask was visible. The arm wrapped around the courier was covered in dark gray panels connected to a brown undersuit. His right arm, however, had a sickle attached to it, like it was some kind of weapon built into the suit. The blade of the sickle was placed tight against the courier's neck. He was petrified and barely got out of his last word. Help. In a flash, the sickle sliced through his neck like butter. With a blank expression, his head rolled to the ground. This pushed Daisy over the edge, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. I started firing at the Reaper, but he darted quickly out of the way, disappearing into the forest of petrified trees. The last thing I saw was the bright red sickle that had been stitched onto the back of his cloak.
So, he didn't attack you?
No. Apparently, he really was only after the courier. When I walked up to the body, the courier's saddlebag was gone. The Red Reaper had taken whatever cargo he was transporting.
Was Daisy okay?
Yeah, she was fine. She was traumatized and had pissed herself, but otherwise okay. After a shock like that, neither of us were thinking about going back to bed, so we just kept walking through the night and ended up in the city the next morning.
How strange. So you'd never seen this Red Reaper before?
I never even heard of him before. This courier was talking about him like he was some urban legend, but Daisy and I saw him with our own two eyes, and now I want to know more. If any of you out there have any information about this guy, please pass this message along to one of the Batted's bodyguards.
Or you can contact me and we'll deliver the message as well.
I don't know what this guy's intentions are, or what exactly he took from the courier, but he was definitely very threatening. I want to know as much as I can about him in case he shows up along the highway again.
We will absolutely be on the lookout for any news. That's what I'm here for. But perhaps we've kept our guests waiting long enough. This show has reached the point where more and more stories are coming to me from all over the place. So now it's become an exercise in lining them up in an order that you, the listener, might enjoy. Because one thing that's become very apparent is that with every new soul I come into contact with, I start finding similarities, shared experiences. How the wasteland is not so big that we don't begin crossing similar paths. So with that in mind, tonight's guest is none other than a Steel Ranger, but coming from a quite unique place in the wasteland. Welcome to the show, Paladin Sandstone.
Thank you, DJ Pony. I appreciate you having me here. It's a pleasure meeting your staff as well.
The pleasure is all ours, soldier boy. You fill out that armor well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Easy, battered. Don't scare him off. Although as a Steel Ranger, I'm guessing you don't scare easy at all.
No, sir. To be honest, I've seen too much of what's out there to be scared by it at this point.
So, you're the first proper guest that wasn't part of my moderate circle of friends before coming on the air. What inspired you to tell your story?
Well, I've traveled all over the Wasteland for many years now, and heard your show for quite a few of them. Where I live these days is not far outside of the city, so I usually pick up a clear signal when I'm cleaning weapons or something similar. I'm not normally the storytelling type, but I must say I was very moved by Miss Amber Horn's story a few weeks ago.
Why, thank you.
Especially the way it ended. I'm hoping that by coming on the air, I'll be able to bring about some closure for myself.
Yes, I think closure is something we could all use, but perhaps we should start from the beginning for the sake of the audience, because you're not just the average Wastelander.
Not with a suit like that.
For you listeners who may not be aware what the Steel Rangers are, they're the ponies trotting around in the full-body suits of armor with the big-ass guns hanging off of them. They were originally a special division of the military during the Great War, but now they seem to have fractured off into a bunch of different groups.
That's correct. Even back then, there were many different battalions of Steel Rangers serving many different functions for the war effort. However, since then, they have reorganized for the most part based on whatever pre-war military facility they took shelter in.
And it was the same for you?
Yes. My ancestors were part of the Equestrian Army Special Material Command.
Interesting. So they were tasked with keeping track of military weapons and technology?
Not just keeping, but long-term storage. The conflict with the Zebras was very heated even before the invention of the megaspells. The Old Kingdom had reached the point of total war, where almost every company, industry, and citizen was contributing to the war effort in one way or another, which meant they were developing many different kinds of weapons, some conventional and some highly experimental. Not all of them actually got used during the Great War. In fact, when news broke out that the Zebras had megaspells too, it pretty much became an accepted fact that there would be a full-on exchange of balefire bombs.
They knew even then.
Oh yes, which is why so many things were built to survive the coming balefire apocalypse. Stabletech specifically were commissioned to construct all those civilian shelters.
We've heard quite a few stories about those.
But obviously they were more than just the stables. Almost every military facility had some kind of function planned for it after surviving the Great War. The Special Material Command were put in charge of constructing and maintaining special underground storage outposts so that the military could be rebuilt after the war and reclaim control of the wasteland. During the war, the outposts were very vital when constructed. They were the vaults that would hold the weapons to retake the world, to start picking ourselves up from the ashes. It was to be expected that they put a garrison of elite units in charge of their operation and maintenance. But something a lot of modern people don't understand is that in a lot of ways the war went on much longer than expected. Yes, the invention of the megaspells changed the landscape, setting us up for the doomsday preparation, but the reality was that neither side was genocidal. They weren't seeking total eradication of the enemy. It was like most wars throughout history. One side did something that offended the other, but instead of cooler heads prevailing, there were retaliations back and forth which ratcheted things up to the war it was. So, because both sides were hesitant to actually use the megaspells, the conventional war raged on, and we were still losing hundreds of soldiers every day. In light of this, the 24 outposts had become a major waste of horsepower. That's when the decision was made to seal up all but one of the outposts and only keep a small standing unit at Castle Alpha.
So they just abandoned the others?
Not abandoned per se. They were fully stocked and ready to house a population during the fallout. But something went wrong on the day the bombs began dropping. They got word when the strike happened in Manhattan, and from there everyone began preparing to seal up the castle. But as they were checking the regular reports from other military installations, suddenly all the comms went dark.
Oh no.
Because Thunder Valley is so remote, there had to be a series of communication stations between there and the capital. So we assumed that one of them must have been hit.
So that was just it? They were completely in the dark?
Well, yes and no. There were some underground data lines between us and Castle Alpha and about 10 of the nearest outposts, but there simply wasn't enough time to build the others when the bombs dropped, so everything east of Canyon City was unreachable.
So there were 10 outposts for you to keep an eye on, to see who would get inside.
Yes. Protocol stated that the top 100 military officers in the area would be granted access, which all of us assumed would really be the first 100 ponies to get to the doors.
But that isn't what happened.
No. Half of the outposts we had contact with were near Thunder Valley. There was no war there. The front line was far away from us, so the only military units anywhere in the region were those holed up in Castle Alpha. There were a few small civilian towns scattered around the area. We were ready to pull open the doors for anyone who came knocking, but they either forgot about the outposts or didn't bother to try. And within 2 hours, the world had been completely swallowed up.
So, no one reached the outposts?
Not a single soul. At least for the ones we had data connection with. Although the starting capacity was 100, each outpost is able to sustain a standing population of 500, which we would have let in. But those were 5,000 slots that sat empty while the surface was bathed in bright green fire.
How tragic. So, how many were ultimately sealed up in Castle Alpha?
There were 1,000 at the beginning. Castle Alpha was designed to sustain 2,500, but like I said before, they needed most of those troops for the battlefield.
Now, when you say Castle Alpha, do you literally mean a castle?
Oh, no. That's just the old code name the facility was given during the war. It's just like a stable or any other bomb-proof installation. Most of the mountains around Thunder Valley are made up of thick rock layers, and the shelter was buried pretty deeply into one of those mountains.
I had to ask, because so many Steel Rangers act more like medieval knights than an old military unit.
I've wondered that myself. The Special Material Command stayed isolated from any of the others that survived the war, but we ended up doing the same thing. I think in a way it's comforting. Now that civilization had reset, it seemed like the right course to follow. Like in our own way, we're hoping that by retreading our steps, we can progress back to the great civilization we had built.
And with a name like Paladin Sandstone, I'm guessing your garrison restructured in a similar way.
We did, but it was not immediate. In a lot of ways, the months after the war involved a lot of sitting and waiting. Colonel Hardwig, the commanding officer at the time, asserted that we spend time making sure all the life support systems and measures were working as expected. There really wasn't much we could do at the time. Immediately after the war, the atmosphere had become almost a solid fog of noxious poison. It took many months for that fog to eventually start to settle. Using our exterior cameras, we couldn't even see the cloud layer above us until day 156.
5 months? Wow, that's a long time.
As the days went on after that, most of the radioactive particles had settled into those cloud layers, or on the ground below.
And yet, after all that time, you still hadn't heard from anyone?
No one. A small part of us thought something might have gone wrong, and that we were the only ones left. Even though that wasn't literally true, in a lot of ways that's still how we had to live. You see, Thunder Valley gets its name for 3 good reasons. First off, it's surrounded on both sides by a mountain range, making it a valley. Secondly, the valley is infamous for its seismic activity. Part of the reason that area didn't have many towns or settlements is because little wooden homesteads wouldn't be able to take the frequent earthquakes. Every couple of weeks they'd be damaged or shaken to the ground.
Every couple of weeks? By the goddesses? And that wasn't a result of the war? It was that way before?
As far as I know. But I'm not sure if it got the name Thunder Valley before or after the war. When you're planning on building underground bomb-proof military facilities, earthquakes really don't matter much. Castle Alpha, as well as the outposts, were all constructed with a dynamic outer shell. Between the bedrock, concrete, and metal is a system of large, heavy-duty springs that can absorb a great deal of seismic forces. Their primary function and design was to resist the shock waves from a balefire bomb, so the occasional earthquake doesn't bother them at all.
So frequent earthquakes probably cause frequent rock slides, hence the name Thunder Valley?
That's part of the reason. But the third origin of its name refers to the thunderstorms that plagued the northern half of the valley. I'm guessing those began happening after the war, because otherwise, I'm not sure why they would have built one of those white spires there.
White spires?
Yeah, you know, those big white spires that are scattered every 100 miles or so. You can't even see the top of them because of the cloud layer.
Oh, yes. Those.
I still don't know what the damn things were meant to do. The Special Material Command didn't oversee them at all. But either the earthquakes or something that happened in the war causes one to crack.
Crack?
Yeah, it's very noticeable. You can see the black hairline run up along the side. Then about 1/3 up from the bottom, the crack deviates to the side, forming a belt line. That circular rupture causes the structure to lean toward the hairline crack. Since then, we started calling it the Crooked Spire.
How strange. I didn't know those spires could be damaged. I've never seen one with any kind of outer decay.
Whoever built it obviously didn't take into account the earthquake conditions of the valley. They must have had their head in the clouds. But anyway, that's on the northwest rim of the valley, where most of the thunderstorms happen. And not just regular thunderstorms, but constant electrical activity. You can almost set a watch to the lightning strikes. Our scribes figured one of the bombs must have gone off there and created the weird weather conditions.
You mentioned a scribe. How exactly was your Steel Ranger garrison organized?
Well, one of the first changes, even before the bombs fell, was that we didn't use the name Steel Rangers. A Steel Ranger was just another way of saying a heavy infantry trooper, or a special operations unit. The only reason the name took such a great hold in the public consciousness was because of the propaganda. In those days, the defining feature of the Steel Rangers was what everyone still knows them for, their high-tech power armor. That armor was such an incredible invention that it almost created a turning point in the conventional war. They became a symbol of national strength and innovation, and thus popped up in a lot of posters and songs. You know, to keep up the public morale.
We here at DJ Pony Studios are quite aware how much propaganda existed in the songs of old.
I'm not complaining myself. They turned out some catchy numbers.
So I'm guessing that you didn't have radio reception for my station from Castle Alpha.
No, I'm afraid we didn't. But we had our own broadcast network through the underground lines and in our helmet radios. We had tons of those old songs. Even our own crazy radio personality.
Really?
Oh yeah. That guy was a real chatterbox even before landing the gig. Every day after the morning attention, he'd kick off his broadcast with, "Good morning, Thunder Valley. How's it shaking?" I said, "How's it shaking?" He'd go on like that 3 or 4 times until he thought enough people answered him. He'd wait for answers like, "It's shaking a lot." Instead, people would usually give answers like, "Shut the fuck up," or "It's too damn early for this."
Good thing radio only works one way.
Oh, he got to hear everyone's opinion at one point or another. But that bastard always took it with a laugh. And one thing no one could deny, he really helped wake us up in the morning.
Anyway, back to the Steel Rangers.
Right. So basically people will just call anyone they see wearing power armor a Steel Ranger, when in reality, many of them have no affiliation with any existing organization that may or may not have pre-war roots. For us, in Casa Alpha, Ranger was a term saved for a very specific group. After living underground for a while, it became apparent that we were on our own. So, Colonel Hardwick reorganized us into the guardianship.
The guardianship?
Yes. It was our ultimate purpose and moral duty to protect the old world weapons that we had stored and keep them safe for future use by a deserving, righteous government that would rise up to restore the equestrian homeland. Sorry if that sounds silly, but it's basically an exact quote from the scroll, which was the document and bylaws that chronicled all of these changes. The guardianship was broken down into 5 orders: the Order of Builders, the Order of Keepers, the Order of Mercy, the Order of Justice, and the Order of Rangers.
Ah, okay.
Each order was meant to serve some kind of function in our new moral objective. You see, we had a goal that we were always working towards. It was one thing that kept us all very united. We had been sealed inside Castle Alpha with little or no connection to any of the 23 outposts. So the ultimate purpose of the guardianship was to reach every last outpost and reconnect them together, so that when the time comes, we can support the righteous new government, whether that be a princess or goddess or senate. That was up for interpretation.
That sounds dangerous. The most important part of safeguarding weapons is being able to properly discern who is worthy to wield them.
There was a whole section outlining the characteristics of a righteous government, but honestly, nothing has even come close. So we just used the weapons ourselves, although sparingly. Still, this mission kept the guardianship bound together, and every pony had a clear function they could serve to advance that interest. The Order of Builders were our engineers. They maintained the bases, operated mining machinery, and built and modified our railroads.
Railroads?
That was how the outposts were connected to Castle Alpha. All of the installations in Thunder Valley were built into old mines. Most of those mines were already connected by railroad tracks, which is how the weapons were brought there in the first place. All the outposts were outfitted with a train depot connected to the national tracks. It became a way for us to quickly travel between the different bases and stay united under our leadership. After them were the Order of Keepers. The Order of Keepers were the ones responsible for the weapons. They made sure anything we took from the storage was eventually restored to its place. At the beginning, that meant reverse engineering the power armor and other things so we could build new ones ourselves. It also meant improving on those armors and designs with things that adapted better to the challenges of the Wasteland.
Like the armor you're wearing?
Exactly. This is actually called Thunderhoof Power Armor. It's meant to take direct lightning strikes and feed that energy into a spark battery. It's designed to keep you alive when walking through the north side of the valley.
That's definitely a plus.
The Order of Mercy basically handled the health and wellness for the guardianship. They were the doctors, chemists, psychiatrists, religious figures. And they also maintained the food and water rations to make sure things were properly distributed and utilized. The Order of Justice maintained the law and order of the population, having a special unit of Black Knights that acted as our military police. They also handled terminals and administrative tasks associated with keeping everything operational.
That leaves us with the Order of Rangers.
Yes, the Rangers were responsible for all of the wasteland exploration and expeditions. If ever we were going into new or uncharted territory, Rangers led the way. Reclaiming outposts, surveying future railroad tracks, dealing with locals, either diplomatically or violently. That's what the Rangers were meant to do.
It sounds like a noble goal. That was all planned by your first leader, Colonel Hardwick?
Yes. He was apparently always a bit of a visionary type. But the scroll and the guardianship itself didn't just happen. There was an incident that spurred reformation.
What kind of incident?
Well, it was about 5 years after the war. The first exploratory missions into the wasteland had been somewhat successful, leading to the capture of our first outpost, Outpost Beta. But it was no small feat. The operation had them follow one of the old rail lines which circled up and then back down one of the mountains in the valley. This mountain was between a split river that was so toxic and dangerous that even falling in the river was a guaranteed death. Some of the outer features of the mountain had been changed because of earthquakes or the bombs, so several sections of track had to be cleared or rebuilt. No matter how careful the operations were, there were still a handful of deaths. But eventually they reached the blast door of Outpost Beta, and a small population moved in to bring the base back to full operation. However, after having settled in, there was very little travel between the two sites. This eventually led to a schism. The commanding officer of Outpost Beta had taken control. Under the leadership of this Lieutenant Colonel Mason, they declared themselves independent of Castle Alpha. Mason found a way to rise to number 1, and he took it.
A rebellion.
Colonel Hardwick was enraged. After all the lives they lost to retake the base, now his number 2 had gone against his commanding officer and created a mutinous fiefdom. He knew he had to take decisive action, or this would have ripple effects and eventually collapse the whole command. He had to assert his place and their duty as a whole in the new post-apocalyptic world.
What did he do?
Well, one thing Mason underestimated was how interconnected Castle Alpha and the outposts are. The 10 of them with the deep underground data lines almost can't be separated. It might as well be one facility in terms of the servers and digital infrastructure. And all of that is controlled by Castle Alpha's main server. It was nicknamed the Throne, because that is the center of power no matter what you try to do. Mason thought he had separated himself sufficiently. He tried to get the engineers to sever all of the data lines except the communications line, but they didn't get all of them. Not by a long shot. So Colonel Hardwick sent one last ultimatum. He sent a train to wait outside of the blast door of Outpost Beta. He said anyone who came out and surrendered would receive a lesser punishment. After 24 hours, no one came out. Once the time was up, he had the throne server open every door inside and outside the base and shut off the power. From there, he had elite troopers clear out the outpost, killing all 97 of the traitors. Lieutenant Colonel Mason was captured alive, and summarily executed in front of the remaining members of the Special Material Command. Even by the old laws, they had committed a capital offense. The singular mission of their garrison was to act as one unit to preserve the pre-war weapons for future use. Division or mutiny was punishable by death and had to be quickly carried out.
Interesting. So it was because of that incident that Colonel Hardwick enacted the Scroll and that new system of medieval-esque government.
Yes, Colonel Hardwick became our first elder. Below him, the 5 majors became the Grand Paladins, each leading one of the 5 orders. Below them were the Star Paladins, below them were the Standard Paladins, and below them were the normal knights. Elder Hardwick knew that by recreating our government similar to the old kingdoms, he could better maintain the moral resolve to carry out our mission.
And that's how the Special Material Command became the guardianship.
The name is different, but it had to be changed. I think a lot of them, including Colonel Hardwick, expected there to be more of the old government left, a system that had survived the war that we could continue serving. When it became apparent that we were on our own, we had to become a government of our own, waiting for a day when a new nation would arise.
But in the meantime, you had a mission to carry out. You had over 20 more outposts to recover.
Yes. According to the directives of the Scroll, we were to repopulate the 10 outposts we had data connection with first, and would proceed to the others later. On top of that, our goal was to use every new technology we recovered and push that technology further. We knew our mission would take several generations, so we were directed to keep updating our weapons so that they would be fit to serve those future generations against whatever might rise out of the wasteland.
So the first one, Outpost Beta, you reached within a short time. How close were the others?
Thunder Valley is a large place. Accounting for the mountains, rivers, and other natural formations, the entire area covers tens of thousands of square miles. Outpost Beta was located conveniently near us, because both facilities were constructed in the same old copper mine, but all the other mines were separated from us by several natural and non-natural barriers. There were poisonous rivers, broken railroad tracks, mountainous outcroppings, snow, lightning storms, mutant animals. It took a long time to secure each outpost because we had to secure our connections between the outposts. If we couldn't transport food, supplies, and soldiers between all the bases, something else could go wrong, and we would be fractured again. Ever since Elder Hardwick, every new elder tries to recover at least one outpost under their leadership. Not to do so is looked down upon, even if they make great advances or exploration, through us rangers. Without having that concrete accomplishment, they're usually looked at as a failure.
How many failures were there?
Well, before I was born, there were 7 elders after Hardwick. Between the 8 of them, there were only 5 outposts reclaimed throughout the different corners of the region.
What stood in their way, besides the distance?
Well, the post-war fallout eventually settled to a certain consistency, the wasteland as we know it today. And once that happened, maybe 10 years after the Great War, then all of the new life forms started showing up. For about 20 or so years, we were busy dealing with ghouls. It's like every one of those walking skeletons could smell us from hundreds of miles away. So as we were colonizing Outpost Beta and Gamma, they would just keep showing up more and more every day. Elder Stillskin was the one who had to deal with them. She had to launch 3 separate campaigns to wipe out the last of the ghouls that kept showing up. Because of that, she was not able to reach Outpost Kappa in her lifetime. Elder Grassroot had a stroke during his first year as Elder. He was still able to lead for a while, but he was in failing health. After 4 years, he finally died. Then, the leader, when I was born, Elder Pumice, was the first to encounter the Great Arrows.
Ah, not those fuckers.
Who are the Great Arrows?
They're a raider gang that have these little pocket clans all over the wasteland, but have this insane loyalty to their leader. So because they're all over the place, they give that self-declared deity piece of shit a far reach of power. Hence the name, Great Arrows.
So they started showing up when you were born?
Almost 40 years ago, and from that point on became our number one enemy. As soon as they found Thunder Valley, they spread like a virus, digging themselves into every cave and crevice they could, until they were scattered all over the area. Back then, they were following some bastard named Two-Coat. They followed him with an almost religious devotion, like they do with all of their leaders. For them, it's the greatest honor to die trying to accomplish whatever menial task that leader had given them. But that devotion made them extremely organized and dangerous. At that time, Elder Pumice tried following a similar strategy to what Elder Steelskin had done 100 years ago. Keep launching campaigns until you track down the place the enemies are coming from. But instead of a group of ghouls that came from a nearby western settlement, the Great Arrows came from seemingly all sides, and had set up small compounds all over Thunder Valley. Some of them even settled in the Lightning Storm region to the northwest by the Crooked Spire. Because they were so spread out, we couldn't uproot them. Instead of reaching outpost Zeta like he hoped to, Elder Pumice died.
So he was considered a failure then?
He might have been, but his efforts were at least appreciated, after what came next. At the time, I was 8 years old. I had received my mark, and because of that, was beginning my initiate training. That's how it is for all fillies and colts. Once you get your mark, you go through 8 years of training as an initiate before graduating as a knight, roughly around age 16. I was getting to know my squad. The first year of training, you are placed into an 8-person squad that you will be with for the rest of your time as an initiate. It's meant to build camaraderie and unity. The idea was that no matter what your mark was, or what you ended up doing after graduation, you knew you had friends in many different places. You perform to the best of your abilities, knowing everyone you fight for is a friend like that to someone. Because of this lesson, they rarely ever changed those initial squads. But an exception would soon be made because of extraordinary circumstances. As we were beginning our first year and getting grouped with other squads for different classes and such, the new elder after Pumice was trying to establish herself in the history books. She, Elder Feathertail, wanted to be the one who not only claimed Outpost Zeta, but be the first elder to claim an outpost beyond the Thunder Valley region. Outpost Zeta was on the outer ridge of the valley to the north side, lying in the shadow of the Crooked Spire. Then Outpost Theta was beyond that, 100 miles to the northeast. This was a very dangerous route. The train tracks we used to get there ran right through the mouth of the valley, with steep ridges on both sides. That canyon was also the way that many of the Great Arrows used to enter the valley. Despite all of these challenges, Elder Feathertail did not let the Rangers do proper scouting beforehand. They weren't sent on any survey missions or seek and destroy missions to help clear the area. Feathertail just loaded up one massive locomotive with weapons and soldiers and was going to power her way through with a show of force. Of course, she wasn't on the train. She was commanding from the safety of Castle Alpha, and what she would have discovered, had she utilized the Rangers properly, is that the Great Arrows had received a very large shipment of weapons from a mysterious source.
Oh no.
By the time the train had reached the canyon, explosives went off, destroying the track on both sides. And because it takes a certain length of track for a locomotive to slow down, it couldn't slow down in time. All 5 cars were forcibly derailed. The soldiers standing on top of the cars were thrown off to the sides as the train turned over and crumpled against the canyon walls. Once that happened, arrows circled the train from the high vantage points and killed off the soldiers one by one, who were all trapped by the steep mountain ranges. By the end of the day, 124 soldiers were dead. It was the single greatest loss of life in the history of the guardianship, even greater than the 98 traitors who were executed.
That's quite damaging. But a group of raiders was able to take down your soldiers in power armor?
Oh yeah. These damn arrows have a wide assortment of weapons. Every time I've stumbled onto a group of them, there's always one guy who has a gun just as big as mine.
And not only that, but they have a large supply of incendiary explosives, rocket launchers, mines, dynamite, even armor-piercing ammunition. We don't know how or where they got their hooves on so much ordnance, but it was enough to take out the whole train. Plus, they looted the armor and weapons from the bodies of our dead. When we first heard the news, a lot of us initiates took it very badly. My mother was one of the keepers that operated the trains. She was my last parent left, and she was sent on that mission.
I'm so sorry.
I was so upset at the time. I galloped out of the rail depot where we were training, and just kept going until I reached the edge of a cliff. I was surprised to find I wasn't the only one out there. On that same cliff was another initiate from my squad. She was wearing the same armor as me, with her helmet tossed aside. She was sitting there crying by herself. I was about to turn around and leave, let her have her privacy, when she noticed me. "You too?" she said, settling down. "My mother," I said, sitting down next to her. "She was one of the train operators." She had a vibrant red coat and white mane. She turned to look at me with her soft green eyes. "My dad was one of the guards, and now he's gone." Her name was Carmina. She and I ended up sitting there for a long time, looking out over the haze of the valley. We could see the lightning in the distance. Every crack of thunder sounded like a gunshot, even though we knew the battle was already over.
So both of her parents were gone too.
Any kind of job that involves traveling on the surface is considered hazardous. You usually only have one parent left by the time you graduate from training. But this was much worse. Everyone was outraged by the Elder's recklessness and failure to listen to the advice of the Grand Paladins, especially that of the Rangers. She became the first Elder to be stripped of her leadership when all 5 Grand Paladins voted unanimously against her. For her gross negligence in planning the operation and the unprecedented loss of life, it was decided that she be executed. The Orphan Maker, as she is still known, died by firing squad 3 months later.
Well, that's definitely not the legacy she was striving for. Being bold is one thing, but rushing into danger at the expense of others is going to have consequences. And sometimes, the ultimate consequence.
It was one of the only ways to keep the public morale intact. The Grand Paladin of Justice was the one to call for the death penalty. He lost 50 Black Knights in the operation, and was furious that she ignored their earlier input before the mission. After her execution, it was that same Grand Paladin who was selected to replace her. Elder Greycrest and his fiery spirit are what led us in the years afterward as we found ourselves in an all-out war against the Great Arrow Raider clan.
So all of this happened right as you were starting your training? That must have had quite the impact on your childhood.
Like I said earlier, it was one of the few times they ever changed up the initiate squads. I think they were trying to reorganize based on who were the most affected by the loss. For instance, one of the Colts from my squadron, Fuel Rod, almost looked suicidal when they moved him to a different one. In fact, I thought they might be putting him in some kind of advanced therapy or an easier training regimen. He was a very technical kid, really good with terminals and electrical maintenance. I figured they placed him in one of the research labs so he could work in the peace and safety at the castle. Either way, the incident really changed him.
That's one of the hardest lessons of the Wasteland. No matter how happy or innocent a kid might be, going through such trauma at a young age can affect the rest of their life.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
So what about Carmina? Did she stay in your squad?
Yes, she did. We ended up becoming close friends after that. Not the best circumstances to meet under, but it was something very personal we had in common. There was also another Colt who replaced Fuel Rod. His name was Analog Armature.
Analog? You mean like the opposite of digital?
Yeah. His dad worked in one of the machine shops, Order of Keepers. He spent his life putting armor together. He hoped his son would do the same, but instead, Armature almost melted his own legs off in the furnace. He wasn't made for the machine work at all. He actually became very skilled at terminals and programming. He could fix up power armor servos well enough. His dad's vicarious teaching saw to that. But without a doubt, he was best at working with circuitry. That's why we never call him Analog, because the damn name didn't fit him at all. Unfortunately for him, no matter how good Armature was at fixing power armor, using it in battle was a different story. Surface warfare wasn't really his strength, so Carmina and I had to keep his ass alive on several occasions.
Oh, really? Like how?
Well, there was this one training mission we had in our 3rd year. We were all about 11, I think. It became increasingly important to have armed convoys escorting the trains between each outpost, so this was our first chance to practice an operation like that. Armature, Carmina, and I were all on a special platform rig called a defense engine. They are these small locomotives that travel 1 mile ahead of a train to scan the track for any damage or possible raider ambushes. That way, if the defense engine gets derailed, we can send a flare into the sky to notify the train to stop before it hit that problem on the track.
Clever. But what if a track is damaged after you pass?
There's always that possibility, but we keep a spotter on the back to be on lookout as well. As long as we see the explosion within 10 seconds of passing it, we can stop the train before it's too late. But this wasn't something we had a spot for. We were cruising along the tracks on our way to Outpost Gamma. While it wasn't too long of a journey by train, the track passes through a few low visibility spots, including a thicket of cacti. Now, we had done several surface missions in the past, but at least for Carmina and I, this was the one we were waiting for. We were both looking for vengeance, and we were hoping more than anything that we'd run into some great arrows to kill. She and I were both facing left on the engine, while Armature was stationed in the back left corner. He was fidgeting with his armor joints, listening to the electronics move and making sure everything was functioning. Unlike Carmina and I, he was really hoping we didn't run into anyone. He wanted to just pull into Outpost Gamma and breathe a sigh of relief. To my right, Carmina was standing perfectly still at attention. Her shoulder-mounted siege gun was whirring quietly as she cycled between the different types of ammunition.
Siege gun? As in meant for preventing a siege?
Or starting one. That was the standard issue battle saddle that most soldiers were equipped with. It had so many different uses and modifications that almost everyone used a version of it. It started out as a weapon design for small special forces operations, but the original builders never got past the prototype phase when the war ended. But in the 200 years after that, it developed into the most effective multi-use weapon we have available. The rotational housing is mounted closer to the nape of your neck, so you have a much larger firing area. Then, the ammunition feed is actually broken up into 4 different sections, so you can either have a whole supply of one type, or up to 4 different types of ammunition. The standard issue ones are buckshot rounds, armor-piercing slugs, incendiary burst, and microgrenade.
Yeah, that sounds like the recipe to a devastating siege.
It's a great weapon, and it's something Carmina would do whenever she was waiting for a battle to start. Just switch back and forth between the ammo feeds. For her, it was a way to stay focused, as opposed to Armature trying to calm his nerves by fiddling with his armor. "Armature, relax," I said to him. "We're over halfway there."
"This display screen is terrible,"
he said, tweaking with his HUD options.
"What's the point of infrared? We know they can conceal their body heat." "I don't know. Just keep it together before the Paladin notices."
But my warning was too late. The Paladin, who was watching all of us, started shouting, "Armature, stand at attention!" But as he said that, Armature popped his helmet off. By this point, Carmina was watching as well.
"What are you doing?"
she asked. Paladin walked toward him. "Initiate! You return your cover this instant!" "Initiate!" the Paladin shouted again, only a few feet from the 3 of us. But before he reached us, a massive explosion rocked the locomotive. I was able to catch Armature, and his helmet, but since the Paladin was walking, he didn't have his hose planted. As a result, he was thrown off of the defense engine and tumbled into the field of cacti.
Good thing he was wearing armor, because otherwise that sounds painful.
We were all shocked by what happened, and the knight driving the engine brought it to a stop. He gave an order to Carmina. Initiate, send up a flare!
Yes, sir,
She said, dropping the shell into the launcher. A bright red light sailed into the air, pulsing like an automatic weapon.
Did anyone see what happened?
Armature asked, shakily snapping his helmet back into place. There must have been a mine on the track, the knight muttered aloud. He was alone with the 8 of us from the squadron. You 4 come with me. Once we get the Paladin, we'll check the track. The rest of you stay here. Armature, Carmina, and myself were following the knight with another initiate. It was early in the morning, and a small layer of dew had been shaken from the cacti where the Paladin's body had tumbled. When we found him, he was knocked out cold. Paladin! Paladin! The knight was knocking his helmet, trying to wake him up.
I don't think there was a mine on the track,
Carmina said to us.
What do you mean?
Armature asked.
There was a flash of light before the explosion. I think it was an RPG,
she said.
Which means...
Armature said worriedly. Which means the attacker is still watching us, the Paladin said as he was standing up again. The 6 of us galloped back to the defense engine, right as another rocket landed next to us, sending pieces of exploded cactus everywhere.
Southeast!
Carmina yelled, firing 2 micro-grenades back at the assailant. That's when we saw the bastard jump out of his hiding spot and roll off to one side. It was a great arrow, covered in reddish-brown clay to conceal his body heat. He tried to run off, but with all 10 of us firing, he was quickly turned into a pile of bloody meat.
Was he the only one?
Oh no. With him dead, the rest of the ambush popped up and started firing as well. They came up behind us where the rocket had struck the track. We might have been young, but this was what we had been preparing for all our lives. Following the Paladin's leadership, we moved into different positions and stayed in communication with our helmet radios. Our siege guns echoed against the mountainside as one by one we took out the rest of the great arrows in that group. As the dust was settling, only one of them remained. We approached her slowly. The Paladin was wondering if she'd be worth interrogating. Although 3 of her legs had been blown off by this point, so he had to act quickly. He only said one word. Why? She looked up at him, blood dripping from her mouth.
That you would one day bow before Lord TikTok.
She then tossed something in her mouth. Biting down on the cyanide pill, she foamed at the mouth and died. That was the first time we heard the name of the new leader of the Great Arrows. TikTok. It was under his control that the Great Arrows evolved beyond the ragtag gang of raiders we had first discovered, and turned them into an invading army.
TikTok? So what happened to Two-Coat?
Yeah, he get turned into a piece of clothing?
None of us knew for sure. Rumor has it that the new leader had to completely consume their predecessor to assume power, but those were the only 2 leaders we had ever known, so we could only extrapolate so much. We didn't have much information about the Great Arrows, because it was very hard to capture them alive. It was a religious experience for them to die in battle, so even if they were only wounded, they ended up committing suicide before we could get restraints around them. Most of what we knew came from their dying words, or any notes found on their bodies.
So that was how you learned about the existence of TikTok.
Knowing about the change in leadership clarified a lot of questions we've been asking, especially now that we were getting used to their tactics. The Great Arrows seemed focused on raiding our supply trains for anything they could steal. They wanted our technology badly, especially the power armor. Quite a few of them were showing up wearing our power armor as time went on. It was disturbing every time I saw it, having to put an armor-piercing round through a guardianship helmet. It felt wrong. Carmina was the same way. For both of us, we'd have a slight pause, wondering if the power armor we were about to shoot belonged to one of our parents.
That must have been a real struggle.
It was something we never really got over. As the years went on, the arrows would keep raiding trains, killing a few soldiers, and taking their armor, but things had begun to normalize. The war wasn't escalating any greater. The raiders were just another obstacle to conquer as we continued our mission to reclaim all the outposts. It was at our graduation that Elder Greycrest announced an effort to advance toward Outpost Zeta.
Was that controversial after what happened the first time?
It might have been, but Elder Greycrest did all he could to assure the Masters that we were doing things completely different. First off, the canyon was no longer necessary to leave the valley from that side. During the decade since the incident, the Order of Builders had constructed 2 new rail tunnels through the mountains so that we could bypass the canyon completely on both sides. The new tunnel to the west was built by Outpost Delta, so it became known as Delta Pass. That had been the #1 job of the Rangers. They protected the builders as the tunnels were being constructed, and scouted beyond the edges of the valley to see what lies in store.
Because it'd be the Rangers who'd reach the outpost first, pave the way for all the others.
It would eventually, but not right away. We wouldn't just send out Rangers to every outpost unless it became absolutely necessary.
So you'd only focus on one at a time, but what about the possibility that one of the outposts might be easier to take than others, even if it were further away?
The actions of Lieutenant Colonel Mason had forever tainted the way our highest commander gave out information. Many of the new laws written into the scroll were meant to discourage possible mutiny by any means necessary. Elder Hardwick was able to reclaim control of Outpost Beta because the hardline data cables connected the two. But for most of the outposts, we had no view or knowledge of any of them. So if there were a possible breakdown of leadership in the future, knowledge of the other outposts had to be kept secret. Otherwise, everyone would just scramble to a new location. Only the Elder and the Throne Computer knew the location of every outpost. That might have been one of the reasons why they executed Elder Feathertail, so that she wouldn't run off to one of the distant outposts and come back to haunt us later.
That still seems risky to me. What if the Elder had a heart attack and the server was damaged somehow? You could lose knowledge of the outposts.
There was one failsafe installed. In the event of a system malfunction, where we'd have to evacuate Castle Alpha, it would send each Paladin a location of one of the distant outposts. It would then become the duty of those Paladins to take a company of soldiers to each of the outposts. The Elder would relocate to one of them with the master spell matrix of the throne server. He or she would install the throne at that outpost and make connection with the others as soon as possible. Only under those circumstances would the Rangers be sent to every installation at once. Then they were to reconnect the guardianship and regroup after a full evacuation of the castle.
So just like your original purpose during the war, it was a continuity of government plan.
Absolutely. Our mission was first and foremost to keep the outpost secure for the future righteous government, no matter how long that could take. We had to plan for any possible contingency that might come up before then.
So you said he made this announcement at your graduation ceremony?
Yes, but not like a tacked-on note in a benediction speech. That day is very important for all of the guardianship. It's referred to as Garrison Day, and includes a number of formal ceremonies. New promotions are announced for any knights becoming paladins, or paladins advancing to Star Paladin or Grand Paladin. Graduating that class of initiates and making them knights is just one part of the ceremony. On Garrison Day, the Elder usually gives a long speech about the state of the guardianship, what has happened over the last year, and what the plans are for the coming year.
So, do you walk across the stage in your full armor and get the new rank riveted onto your shoulder?
Not exactly. Actually, it is a very formal occasion, and as such, those not part of the security detail are dressed in their finest suits and dresses.
You're kidding. Somehow, I can't picture you in a tuxedo.
I could clean up enough when the occasion called for it. But in all honesty, that wasn't the focus of my attention. I had trouble keeping my eyes forward after seeing Carmina in her sleek emerald gown.
Ah, here we go.
Well, look, our society was set up in a certain way to be of the utmost benefit to the mission, and one of the ways we fight for that mission is by pairing off and creating the next generation of soldiers.
So it's your patriotic duty.
Well, I guess you could say that. It goes all the way back to when the initiate squadrons are formed. There's always 8 per squadron, 4 males and 4 females. The placement of everyone in their respective squadrons is basically one giant social experiment. Aside from the obvious gender split, they try to balance out each squadron based on the marks of the initiates. Every cult and filling needs to go through the training and learn all the basics of being a productive member of the guardianship. But at the same time, They hope that the members will pair off so that those wanting to follow a hazardous career path will hook up with those that don't. That way, there's always one parent in the base to raise the foals, at least to a certain point.
Is that usually the mares?
Usually. But there were quite a few bucks that ended up being the more present parent. Although these are simply guiding forces, we aren't explicitly paired off based on genetic traits or anything. Plus, other factors came into place as well, specifically one that stood between Carmina and I. There are not supposed to be any romantic connections within the same unit. They say it's bad for the team dynamic, especially where Carmina and I wanted to go. As I stood there on the stage next to her, we both knew we wanted to be rangers. We were going to finish the mission our parents had given their lives for, reclaiming Outpost Zeta. Nothing was more important to us, other than doing it together.
But you couldn't do it together, because they wouldn't let you.
They wouldn't have let us had they known, but so far we had kept our relationship secret. Only Armature knew us as anything more than friends, even if a few others suspected.
Still, I thought the whole point of the squads was that you work with ponies that'll end up in different places, hazardous and non-hazardous. I'm sure someone had to be persuaded to team you up together.
Oh yeah. The person we had to convince was Star Paladin Turquoise. Unlike Carmina and I, he was a unicorn. We never really had any racial problems in the guardianship, but because of their magic and studious tendencies, unicorns often rose to high-up leadership positions or became scribes. Like Armature. He was way too technically smart to end up out on the battlefield, so he ended up in the Order of Justice. He became a scribe who helped maintain their terminal systems, doing coding and programming type tasks.
So at least you and Carmina didn't have to focus on keeping him alive anymore.
No, thank goddess. He was safe inside Castle Alpha, which was new for him since he was actually born in Outpost Kappa. Whether you're born in Castle Alpha or one of the outposts can affect your mindset and how you are raised. Star Paladin Turquoise was one of the crazier ones. He was born inside Outpost Delta, which lies inside of the Thunderstorm region. Those initiates become battle-hardened very quickly, because one wrong move can cause certain death. Every time they step outside, bolts of green lightning are striking all around them. Turquoise was an especially cunning buck, who embraced heading out into the storm. For him, every challenge was a thrill, something to be navigated around. He was born to be a ranger and rose through the ranks quickly. Upon receiving applications from both Carmina and I, he called us in to be interviewed together. We were both seated in his office at Outpost Delta. We removed our armor, as was customary, and were only wearing our standard-issue bodysuits. He began with a prodding tone, finding the situation amusing.
So, knights, I am told that you are both requesting to be placed in my platoon. Is there any particular reason you want to stick together? Haven't you seen enough of each other after 8 years?
Sir, Carmina began.
Knight Sandstone and I have developed superb tactical cooperation in the field. We have used this to our advantage during many operations together. Because we were both seeking to join the Order of Rangers, we thought it would be beneficial to the battalion as a whole.
What she meant was that she has specialized as a sniper, becoming an expert shot with long-range weapons, whereas I had specialized in close-quarters combat. In the past, she would find a vantage point and feed me recon while I moved through an area and took out any threats she couldn't hit with her 308. The Star Paladin seemed to be accepting that answer.
Is this true, Knight Sandstone? Do you and Knight Carmina work so well together?
I answered. Sir, she's a guardian angel. I couldn't imagine being in combat without her.
Aw, that's sweet.
Probably not the best wording, though.
No, it wasn't. He started quoting us chapter and verse on the regulations.
I'm sure I don't need to remind either of you that relational conduct within a platoon must be strictly professional for the sake of the ultimate mission at hand. That any evidence of relationship that is not strictly professional could be met with harsh punishment as stated in the scroll.
We were expecting this might happen. We knew we had to give him something. We had to expose ourselves enough to convince the Star Paladin. Sir, I began. It is not like that. Both of our parents were murdered in the Blood Canyon Massacre.
Hearing that made Turquoise's eyes wince, and I could see a bit of sympathy. I continued. We were both made orphans by Elder Feathertail, sir. It was the first year of our training, and we were still young. Carmina took over. Since then, we have stuck together like brother and sister. We're the only family either of us has left. If you will give us a chance, sir, we will not let you down. Star Paladin Turquoise looked over us thoughtfully, peering deep into our eyes. He finally breathed out and leaned back in his seat. Well then, I'll have to see this for myself. Congratulations, and welcome to the Rangers, 1st Platoon. Sir! We saluted him as he signaled us to leave. We turned a corner to an empty hallway and hugged tightly as I spun her around.
Young love.
Speaking of love, I think our audience would love to have a short break. Everyone take a minute to drain the main radioactive vein and maybe grab a snack. Until then, we'll be right back.
Was a hot and sunny autumn in a town so long ago, nestled close between the mountains on a painted desert floor. Didn't bother folks around them near the quiet prairie strip, but they had themselves a ranger with a big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip. It was early in the morning when the ranger heard the call. Always thankful for the ranger with a big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you finished your mission with great success and are ready to continue with tonight's episode of Confessions of a Wasteland Pony. Everything still working on your end, Amber?
We're doing just fine.
Excellent. Well then, we continue with the story of Paladin Sandstone. After completing their years of training, Sandstone and his battle buddy were able to convince their commanding officer to join the same platoon. So, after proving that love conquers all, what happened next?
Now, we had our chance. We were going to avenge our parents' deaths and finish their fight to capture outpost Zeta. Over the next year, we went through several ranger training missions. We got to know Turquoise very well as our platoon readied ourselves to take outpost Zeta. During that year, the 3rd Ranger platoon was scouting the north side of Thunder Valley, getting a general layout of the area and where the major Great Arrow encampments were. Once enough preparation had been done, it was announced that we were being deployed to take the outpost. The first phase of our mission was to occupy an old pre-war town just beyond Thunder Valley. The giant blast door of Outpost Delta opened and we could see the lightning arcing down from the sky. We were split between 3 defense engines as all of us stayed huddled in the central cabin. Lightning quickly struck the metal guardrails and steel walls of cabin. Each bolt was absorbed by special wiring, which lit up as the energy was transferred into the large spark battery. It worked the same way as our Thunderhoof armor. The engines rolled down the track being driven by that same spark battery. The track circled up the face of the mountainside, where light snowfall covered the ground, until we eventually reached Delta Pass. On each side of the track was a large guardhouse where 2 heavily armed paladins examined the trains and our manifest. Then, the operator in one of the guardhouses pulled a lever and the giant titanium doors slid open. Once they were, the trains passed into the tunnel. We rolled by several concrete columns, which were supporting the carved bedrock around us. The doors slid open on the other side and we pulled out, having a perfect view of the rest of the wasteland. The crooked spire was behind us now.
So now that you were outside the valley, was this all uncharted territory?
Not exactly. The builders had laid out the new track all the way down to old pre-war track that circled the mountain.
Although that mountainside was still in the lightning storm region, and very few great arrows had a kind of thunderhoof armor to walk safely through it. So once our defense engines reached the old track, it was pretty much a straight shot to outpost Zeta along that line. However, there were a few barriers in our way, such as the town of Prairie Springs. Beyond the edges of the lightning storm, the great arrows had fortified the town, making it the front lines of their territory. Once we reached the border of the lightning storm, Star Paladin Turquoise commanded us. "All right, Rangers, you all know the plan. We need to clear the raider scum off our tracks. Fire teams, get to your positions." Several groups dismounted the trains and fanned out, approaching the town from two sides. Carmina was up on a cliff behind me. She sent me a direct communication.
Ready to go?
"As long as you have my back," I responded. We could see great arrows walking around freely in the town center. It didn't look like they detected us yet. That's when the front engine came rolling along on the track. That got their attention. They began shooting at the train, but the front was heavily armored. It brushed off their RPG rounds and slammed right through the gate. As soon as it reached the station, the train exploded in a bright flash of orange and yellow. We had loaded full of thermal explosives, which did their job nicely. Any building not incinerated was now on fire, forcing the survivors to flee to the outer buildings.
Kick ass. That's one way to make an entrance.
The second rig rolled into the town square on the last section of undamaged track. A fire team of rangers started shooting from the top of the platform. The great arrows began firing back at them, while taking cover in the outer rings of buildings. While the train distracted them, the rest of us snuck up from behind and started taking them out one by one. I galloped in from behind some rocks and pounced on a raider who had his back to me. Before he could yell out, I clamped his jaw shut and snapped his neck. Up ahead of him, two more were firing at the defense engine through an alleyway. I switched my siege gun to slug and fired. The bullet exploded through the ribs of the nearest one and took off the leg of the one in front of him. He dropped to the ground screaming, and I leveled the gun between his eyes. The screaming stopped. Next to them was a two-story building, one of the largest structures still standing. Carmina warned me from over the radio.
There's one behind the door.
Gotcha, I said, readying my assault. I bucked open the door and pumped a shotgun round into the surprised raider pressed up against it. He was pushed back against the far wall, where dark red blood splattered out from his body. I turned the corner for the staircase, but at the top a second arrow blocked my way. He pulled the pin of a grenade, but before he could toss it, a shot rang out through the window and his head disappeared in front of me. The grenade dropped behind him and exploded a hole in the outer wall. The body tumbled down the stairs as I galloped past it. Out of the hole in the wall, I looked up towards the cliff. "Did you leave anyone for me?" I asked.
"Sorry,"
Carmina answered,
"but they just kept walking into my sights."
I looked out of the building's front window to see that the rangers on the defense engine were no longer firing. Other close combat knights had walked into the town center where half of the buildings were still burning. "Good work, knights!" we heard Star Paladin Turquoise exclaim. "A nice clean operation. You've done the rangers proud. With Prairie Springs secured, we now have our first defensible stronghold beyond Thunder Valley. At least it will be once we get some new walls put up. Paladin Quarry, bring in the builders." The last defense engine came into town and unloaded a squadron of builders and black knights to defend them.
Wait, weren't the Rangers going to do that?
No. Our platoon was moving forward. We were sure that the great arrows would notice the fires very quickly and begin regrouping, so we had to maintain our momentum to clear out as many of their scouts as we could. That little town was the last bit of territory we had explored, so we had to press forward and chart the rest of the track. There were still 150 miles of it between us and outpost Zeta, and we had no idea what else was waiting for us.
So you just walked out of the firefight and continued on?
More or less. A large supply train came in that night once we reported that the town was secured. From there, we resupplied on all the essentials, food, water, and ammo, and headed for the mountainside. We were hoofing it from there on out. We left at nightfall to take advantage of the darkness. After a change, we left our Thunderhoof suits in Prairie Springs and switched out to the tactical recon armor.
That's gotta be a time-consuming process. It looks like you're bolted into those suits. I'd hate to be stuck in one of them.
It's actually not as hard as you might think. It's made to be easy to use and operate. Power armor is essentially two different pieces, the power and the armor. The power, or rather the spark battery-powered exoskeleton, is a metal framework that can be fitted to the specific pony, or even adjusted automatically. This is where all the important pieces are involved. The circuitry, servos, and pneumatics are all hidden within the exoskeleton to have a dual layer of protection. Then, the armor is actually individual panel pieces that can snap into their section. Breastplate, horseshoes, tailguard. They all just plug into the exoskeleton, which then locks them into place with a tight air seal.
You're quite knowledgeable about it, but that just makes it sound like a bigger pain in the ass to take off.
We have to know our suits. It's even more important than knowing our weapons. Each initiate must be able to do a reasonable amount of field repair to his power armor, should he need to fix it in the heat of battle. I don't know how to forge new parts, or wire up the servos like armature, but I know enough. And exiting or entering a whole suit is actually really simple. You just trigger a control in your helmet, or use the manual emergency release. You lean forward like you're stretching, and the center line along the back will open up like a butterfly cocoon. You stand up and step out of the exoskeleton wearing just your bodysuit and helmet.
Well, that's good to know, that you don't have to carry a tool case around just to change your clothes. So, now that you were fitted with your recon armor, you left for your expedition across the mountainside?
Yes. The old train track ran along the bottom of the mountain. North of us was the empty Wasteland Plateau, and south of us, on the other side of the mountain, was Thunder Valley. The only light we had was the flickering glow around the crooked spire, where the yellowish-green lightning strikes touched down behind us. With our night vision goggles, we ascended up the cliff and headed east, parallel with the tracks. The platoon was spread pretty far apart along the ridges, so it was just Carmina and I walking for a while.
So you could talk freely, a bit more personal time.
Yeah. The whole first night was surreal. We were still full of adrenaline after the battle, so the platoon walked for a long time before the Star Paladin ordered to break. There wasn't much to do but take in the scenery.
What did you picture?
Carmina said to me. What do you mean? I asked.
What did you think it would look like beyond the valley?
She turned her head left, gazing out over the empty landscape. I wasn't expecting there to be color, I said. The plateau had a slight pinkish-white tinge to the dirt that seemed to go on forever.
What do you think lies beyond there?
She said, taking off her helmet to see it with her own eyes. Eyes that glisten like emeralds.
Do you think there are others out there? Some great kingdom that has already risen up from the ashes? There could be a new king, or princess, or goddess.
I took off my own helmet and sat down next to her. I wonder how much of the old capital is still standing. The pictures make it look like it was just barely hanging off the mountain. She considered that for a moment, then frowned a little.
What if there's someone there in the high castle? Some new kingdom that has risen up and ruled for the last 100 years? What if beyond the plateau all the world has been restored and we're just living here in the last of this wasteland? She was becoming very bothered by the idea. I put my hoof on her shoulder. She continued. The world could have completely moved on without us, forgetting that we are even here. We've devoted our entire existence to marching on, reclaiming all these outposts. We're supposed to need them to bring about some kind of change, some better world. But what if some better world has already appeared? What if this is all worthless? Then she showed the true source of those feelings. What if our parents died for nothing? Tears were rolling down her cheeks as I took her in my arms. I held her there while she sobbed, and for a moment, I was devastated by the idea myself. What if she was right? What if we reached the other side of the Great Salt Plateau and found a world totally restored, like we were stuck in some cursed time capsule? But the reality was, neither of us might ever see what was beyond that vast emptiness. We had to hold on to any hope that we could. If we didn't, it would drive us mad. So I reminded her of something that always comforted me. We know what lies beyond, because we've seen the things that come from there. These monstrous creatures that can barely be called ponies, and whoever this TikTok is that sends them after us. Does that sound like a better world? A world full of psychopaths and walking corpses? Even if all we do is burn every one of them to the ground, we'll have made a difference. We'll have followed our duty. She was starting to calm down. I pulled back and looked into her eyes. We are going to take Outpost Zeta, and one day all the rest of them. Until the great arrows are dead and gone. Until then, it won't be a better world. It's the reason why we need to keep fighting. You're right, she said. I guess I can't believe that we're finally this close. We're going to make it, I said. And we kissed there on the mountainside against the glow of a lightning strike.
Damn, that's a lucky mare.
It must have been very emotional for you, too. It's what you had been preparing for most of your life.
Oh, it was. We were both relatively young. Still teenagers.
They say that we are shaped by the times that we live in, to think that these days in our short lives we face so much. Even as teenagers, we feel like adults. For far too many out there, the young are robbed of their youth, and see the world through aged eyes waiting for the storm to end.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
So, after that emotional first night, what happened next?
Well, the scouting mission continued on for several weeks. We had to move in a slow line across the whole mountain face and across the railroad track. Every area had to be covered so we could root out every stray great arrow and make sure no one was able to sneak up behind us.
That's quite the expedition. What did you have to eat? I doubt you could get hot meals in some canteen cafeteria.
Damn, I wish we could have. No, the diet of a ranger involves eating a lot of field ration bars. Technically, you can live off of the bars by themselves. Every ranger is supposed to carry 2 weeks' worth at all times. But the thing is, they taste really bland, like a candy bar with no sweet flavor. So because of that, rangers would flavor the bars themselves, covering them in hot sauce, barbecue sauce, lemon juice, all sorts of flavors.
That's where innovation comes into play, making the meal actually taste good. So when exactly would you eat if you're climbing up and down the mountain all day?
We'd eat whenever we stopped to sleep, have dinner before going to bed, and breakfast when we get up.
Sleeping must have been risky, though, trying to avoid all those stray great arrows.
There would be guards awake in shifts. Plus, the whole platoon never slept together. We were in pockets of 8 scattered up and down the mountain. That way, if one group did get attacked or report that they found something, the other groups could come in from both sides and back them up, surprising the enemy in the process.
Okay.
But like I said, those were just the occasional 1 or 2 raiders. Not all of them got the message that we had taken over Prairie Springs. So we find the random buck or mare traveling toward us and take them out. They weren't much of a threat at all. In fact, the only thing trying to kill us all at once was a foe we'd known for an even longer time. It was about 3 weeks into the expedition, early in the morning. Carmina was up already, being part of the last guard for the night. She had her helmet off and was eating a ration bar. She saw that I opened my eyes and smiled. I smiled back, but that quickly turned into a frown. Behind her, I could see a large boulder starting to move. In a moment, it was tipping over, about to crush her. I shouted, "Look out!" and jumped up. I pushed her out of the way and we went tumbling to the side, just barely escaping the weight of the stone. "What was that?" she said, as the rest of our fire team woke up from the sound. That's when all the other rocks around us started moving too, including the mountain beneath our hooves. "Earthquake!" I said. "Helmets on! Evasive procedures!" Rocks of all sizes rolling down the mountain now. Even the small ones could be deadly from their speed alone. We were diving from side to side, trying to hide behind outcroppings that blocked the falling stones. After 10 seconds, which felt like an eternity, the shaking finally stopped. "Status report!" Turquoise said over the radio. "Are there any injuries?" All the teams reported in. "Squad 3 is fine. Squad 2 is fine. Squad 5, we have one who took a blow to the head, but his helmet absorbed most of the impact. He should be okay." Carmina called in. "Squad 4 is okay," then glanced at me. "But it was a close call." "Good," the Star Paladin answered. "If there are any injuries, see a medic right away. Once everyone's patched up, we'll get moving."
So these earthquakes happen every couple of weeks?
Yep. Even outside of Thunder Valley, the region was still a threat, but we just shrug it off and keep on moving. We had grown up with the quakes, so we knew how to handle ourselves. We kept pushing forward until we were nearing the mouth of Blood Canyon. Our parents hadn't even passed 10 miles into the canyon when they were attacked, so we knew the Great Arrows must have some kind of encampment near the canyon's ridge. When the Rangers reached the mouth of the canyon, we saw the old mine sitting carved into the tallest ridge. The mine's entrance was sealed up by a distinct blue-gray titanium door with a white curled symbol painted on top of it. Outpost Zeta. The door sat undisturbed, surrounded by reinforced concrete along the sides of the train tracks entering the bunker. This was our prize. The mission we had been preparing for all our lives. We would also have a chance to exact some much-needed revenge. Because around the door of Outpost Zeta, the old mining town was now populated by a large number of Great Arrows.
They had already taken the outpost?
Oh, no. The outpost was sealed tight as a crypt. We knew they had tried to get into it in the past. The data lines fed the security camera footage back to Castle Alpha. You could only open the door if you knew the right access code, or we opened it from Castle Alpha using the throne terminal.
Well, that's good then. They were only a blemish on the outside. One more thing you had to clear off the tracks.
Exactly. And this time the tables were turned. We controlled the mountain and had them surrounded from all sides. Star Paladin Turquoise had a 3-part operation in mind for how we would attack. After our supply train arrived and we full stocked up, we set things into motion.
Was it another plan to send in an exploding train car?
Not this time. If we exploded any large bombs against a mining town, the shockwaves could cause another rock slide and threaten our units on surrounding hills. You have to remember that the whole reason for our existence is to protect and maintain a large supply of military weapons. So we had some creative tools at our disposal. Since the Rangers had cleared away all the long-range scouts, we sent our secret weapon into Blood Canyon. A single locomotive rolled silently through the shadows, stopping only when it arrived at the wreckage of that fateful train. 24 Black Knights jumped off of the locomotive and stood in reverence of the 124 soldiers who had given their lives for the guardianship. Then, a rainbow of colors erupted from their 24 horns and wrapped around their locomotive. The massive weapon rose off of the rails and slowly floated forward, passing over the destroyed section of track. They set it down on the other side and remounted the engine, rolling forward between the steep cliffs. On the railroad tracks we had explored, a second ranger platoon arrived, being led by Star Paladin Sagebrush. They were there to cut off any raider escape north over the plateau. Once everything was in position, Turquoise began the attack. Us rangers on the mountain launched smoke grenades down into the mining town to block their view of us from below. Once a thick haze had formed, we followed the smoke grenades with firebombs. They have very low explosive shockwave, but instead cover an area with a chemical fire that burns extremely hot. In their panic and confusion, the Great Arrows began fleeing the town and ran into the second platoon of Rangers, which forced them to retreat into the canyon. You see, this was the payback we had planned for a long time, giving these filthy raiders a taste of their own horrible bloodshed. As soon as they entered the canyon, the Arrows found themselves face to face with the barrel of a 20-foot-long Gatling gun that was blocking their escape. The rail-based heavy assault weapon was fully loaded with nearly 1 million rounds of 30mm ammunition, firing at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The raiders were turned into a bloody mist in a matter of seconds.
Holy damn. No wonder you call it Blood Canyon.
After only 20 minutes, the battle was over. We had burned down the entire mining town. Nothing was left but ash and cinders. Based on our estimates, we were able to kill nearly 75% of the raiders with a heavy Gatling gun, which was a cause of personal satisfaction for all involved. Once we were sure that the area was secure, Star Paladin Turquoise typed in the access code, and the mighty door of Outpost Zeta slid open for the first time in 175 years.
Now that must have called for a celebration.
Oh, it absolutely did. The whole platoon, the whole guardianship was elated. This was the resolution to a very long, very terrible campaign against the Great Arrows. All the ranger forces made our way down into the galley level to break open the food supplies, which included a nice stock of wines and liquors. Everyone was celebrating. They began both figuratively and literally imbibing in the sweet taste of victory. For Carmina and I, it felt like a terrible weight had been lifted off our shoulders. We were truly happy, truly fulfilled for the first time in our adult lives. It was the best day ever, which means we got a bit drunk ourselves. And as a result, got caught up in the celebration.
Is it just me, or does that sound like a euphemism?
Definitely a euphemism. But you wouldn't be mentioning it if it weren't relevant. So what happened?
Well, we had left the main party going on in the mess hall and had only been gone for 10 minutes when Star Paladin Turquoise found us in a compromising situation.
No, you don't mean...
We were being intimate.
You were caught with your pants down?
Oh my.
The stupid switching yard was supposed to be empty. Everyone gets away with it there. I'm almost positive that he was following us.
And waited for just the right moment.
Well, as you can imagine, we were both shocked and horrified. Carmina snapped her armor back together faster than I ever seen. She was blushing so hard I thought she'd turn a different shade of red. The worst part was the look on Turquoise's face. He was grinning with that same conniving smile he got after winning an argument. I just knew we were in trouble. Once my armor was closed, we just stood there waiting for his judgment. He started with his usual sly tone. Knight Carmina, Knight Sandstone. I know our recent victory has caused quite the rush of emotion all around, but this is not how a normal brother-sister relationship is supposed to work. Carmina was still blushing, but her stoic expression had returned. We knew we deserved whatever jabs he wanted to give us, so we stood at attention like good soldiers.
After being naughty soldiers.
But we were both surprised when the Star Paladin's tone softened. He was speaking in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Not commanding, not sly or manipulative, but genuine. But things are different for the Rangers, aren't they? We spend so much time out in the field that we barely have time for lives of our own back home. We can get passed between outposts so often. Sometimes you start out with someone, but don't have someone to come back home to. Oftentimes, you might be out surveying a landscape for weeks, or even months at a time. By this point, our hard stance at attention was beginning to falter. This kind of congenial talk was very rare to hear from a commanding officer, especially someone like Turquoise. And considering the situation he found us in, we glanced back and forth at each other in similar confusion. Did I ever tell you about one of my first scouting missions? I was out with a unit surveying possible routes to capture Outpost Lambda. We had been out there for nearly 2 months in the cold snow of winter. Except for a few raider attacks, the mission had been very boring. There was this one mare on my squad, and I'd gotten to know very well. She'd been a good friend. We had pulled each other out of some bad situations. But soon we found ourselves in a situation that we were the cause of. When we got back from that scouting mission, she was pregnant. But luckily, when we came clean to our commanding officer, because you can't hide a baby bump for too long, he was very understanding and got us shuffled around. With a new bundle of joy on the way, she requested a transfer to an administrative post, and I found my way into the war room soon after. A lot of relationships can start quickly, especially for our squad mates, but that doesn't mean they can't stand strong for 30 wonderful years. I could see the way you looked at each other from the first time you applied for the Rangers. I didn't know how long you would last. You never know with 2 nights fresh out of graduation. But I've been waiting to see when you'd slip up, because I wanted to make sure I was the one to catch you first.
By this point, we were both blushing again, but we were breathing much easier. He continued,
So, do be more careful in the future. And if you do want to make long-term plans, so that you don't have to sneak around the vehicle bay, just let me know. I know I could find a permanent place for both of you within the castle.
We were completely surprised by the good fortune. We both thanked him sincerely before he went on his way.
Well, that went better than expected.
We were so relieved after what happened. She and I laughed to ourselves, picturing the Star Paladin, this unstoppable force of will and politics getting a girl pregnant in the field. They must have really had a whirlwind romance. But after the joking was over, we started really considering his offer. We had both completed our main mission in life. We were able to bring about justice for the death of our parents and completed their final mission to reclaim Outpost Zeta. We'd already accomplished more in our lives than most Rangers could hope for, so the idea of settling down for a while was sounding better every day. We could take administrative posts in Castle Alpha, enjoy married life, and have a few foals of our own. Life was looking very bright. Over the next months, the Order of Builders were reconstructing the train tracks in Blood Canyon to reinforce our connection to Outpost Zeta. That way you didn't have to travel through the lightning storms in Delta Pass just to get there and back. Carmina and I had been transferred back to Castle Alpha. Not only was Turquoise true to his word, but we were both promoted to the rank of Paladin within the strategy division. We could help with the long-term planning to eventually retake Outpost Theta. It was over 100 miles away, across the northern Salt Plateau, so it could have easily been a decade before we made a decisive run for it. First, we had to secure our control in and around Thunder Valley and make sure any last great arrows were dealt with.
So, were you looking forward to the domestic life?
I was, actually. It was nice seeing Armature again on a regular basis. He'd been promoted to a full scribe. We saw him all the time whenever we had to run down to get some kind of chart or other information off of the main server. Because his office was right there beside the throne, we ran into Elder Greycrest quite often as well. He was being praised as a hero. The Elder, who had restored the guardianship after Feathertail, the Orphan Maker, threatened to tear it apart. The guardianship was on the brink of entering a new golden age. We'd almost reclaimed all of the data-connected outposts. Once we took the last one in Canyon City, we were going to continue moving east to reach all the distant outposts near the capital and coast. But if that were the end of the story, I wouldn't be here to give my confession.
So, what did happen instead?
It had been a little over 3 months since we had captured Outpost Zeta. All of the Guardianship were still commending how decisive the victory had been against the Great Arrows. There was a lot of talk about how 10 years ago we were seriously concerned with the threat they were to all of us. Our trains used to be attacked during every other transport run. It seemed like the Arrows came out of nowhere just to raid us for any supplies and military tech they could. They stripped every suit of power armor off every dead body they could find. Most of the knights were attributing their success to Elder Greycrest's strong leadership. Some might have called it modesty, but Greycrest never really accepted that explanation.
It almost seemed like the Great Arrows had pulled back their forces over the last few years, like their attention had been directed elsewhere. Everyone thought, or hoped at least, that this was just like when Elder Steelskin wiped out the ghouls from the Western Settlement. We simply killed off the last of the Great Arrows that dared to venture to Thunder Valley. We had won the war, so to speak. What none of us realized was that this was not the beginning of a new era of peace. This was the calm before the storm.
So how did it all go so wrong?
I'll never forget that last night. It was about 2 a.m. I had gotten up to use the restroom as I usually did. It was really hard for a ranger to sleep through the night. We were so used to 4-hour shifts to take turns keeping watch. Once I was done, I got back in bed with Carmina. Even though she was still asleep, she shifted back into my arms when she felt I'd returned. I lie awake for a little while, slowly stroking her white mane. It smelled fresh, like berries. One thing she really missed about life inside was getting to shower regularly. One of those simple comforts, getting to wash away the dirt and grime of the job we had to do. She slept so calmly. Neither of us entertained any thoughts that things were going to change. We were going to start our own family, watch our foals grow up with armatures. As I lay there beside her, that was the future I saw. Then I woke up. A high-pitched scream reverberated through the hallway, rattling through the walls like a muffled cry. We were both sitting up in bed, fully awake, but confused by the distant yet familiar sound. That's when we heard the scream again, and the years of training and discipline roared back into our minds. In a flash, we pulled on our bodysuits and hopped into our power armor. The warning on the heads-up display confirmed our worst fears. Perimeter breach. Hostile forces have infiltrated Castle Alpha. Assume defensive positions. We opened the door of our room and were prepared to lock down the stairwell. We were on the 10th level near the bottom of the castle. Because we worked so close to the war room, we were able to get a suite on the same level. We were moving by pure instinct, letting our years of training drive us. When there was a breach of installation, the idea was that we seal off the elevators and stairwells so the threat would stay contained to that floor. In most of the scenarios we'd run, that involved mainly controlling the 1st or 2nd level. It assumed that one of the guards, somewhere, would have triggered the alarm fairly quickly. Then the team of infiltrators could be put down.
Had something like that happened before?
No. Until then, there had never been a facility breach. The ghouls and mutant animals were too dumb, and the Great Arrows never had the firepower. Carmina and I ran into the hallway and immediately came face to face with a raider in thick metal armor. The buck had barely turned his head to look at us when we both blew him against the wall with armor-piercing rounds. We looked back and forth at each other. "That's one," I said. She then turned her gun toward me. "Duck!" I dropped to the floor right as she fired. A second buck was thrown backwards as his bullet sailed over Carmina's head. I stood up again, covering her blind spot. "How could they be down here already?" I exclaimed. "There's no way they could have gone this far without being detected." Carmina was about to speak, but before she could get the words out, we received a call on our radios.
"Sandstone? Carmina? Are you guys all right?"
It was Armature.
"We're okay,"
Carmina said.
"Where are you?" "I'm at the throne,"
he said.
"I need your help. Please hurry."
Without hesitation, we galloped down the hallway toward the server room. Every time we turned a corner, we ran into another Great Arrow. Every one of them was well armed. High-density slugs slammed into the walls behind us as we fought. We had to be careful. Their bullets could pierce several points on our armor.
So once again, they had powerful weapons. More powerful than any raider should.
They really were an invading army. Everything about the operation was much too organized. This was something they planned for a long time. Once we reached the door, we saw a group of arrows trying to hack the control panel. We launched several microgrenades, sending exploded raider parts bouncing down the opposite hallway. When the coast was clear, we input the correct code and went in. As soon as the door shut behind us, we stood face to face with the Blue Guard, the Elder's personal defenders. The cobalt blue of their helmets shone under the fluorescent lighting as they raised their weapons toward us. "Wait!" I cried.
Then Carmina and I removed our helmets. "It's us."
What's going on?
Carmina asked one of them. He answered in a gruff voice. "Head to the back. You'll see for yourself." We moved past them and walked into the complex. There were several uses for this space. It was the war room, the elders' quarters, the old archives, but we had been called there for a reason, so we turned toward the main server bank. At the center of the room, a single cylindrical tower stood on the floor. Hundreds of wires ran out of the top, connecting it to all the other machines around it, like they were fruit hanging from a tree. Inside that cylinder was the steady magenta glow of the Master Spell Matrix, the throne of Castle Alpha, the center of control for all of the Special Material Command, the symbol of the guardianship. Leading up to it from another direction was a long trail of blood. The blood streaked along the floor like someone was dragging a dead body. A set of bloody hoofprints ran side by side along the streak. At the end of the bloody streak was Elder Greycrest. He was sitting awkwardly at the base of the tower. He was wearing his power armor, but a large chunk of it had exploded along his back. It looked like someone had shoved a grenade into the collar piece. There were 4 others gathered around him. One of them was Star Paladin Humor, one of the leading surgeons in the Order of Mercy. The second was Fuel Rod, the cult who had been transferred from our squadron. He was now a power systems technician, helping fix data and energy lines throughout the castle. The third was Scribe Damon, one of the programmers who worked on the servers, just like Armature, who was sitting beside the Elder, holding him still while Star Paladin Humor was working on him. Several of the bones in the Elder's back were visible. We weren't entirely sure how his right front leg was still attached.
Thank Goddess, you made it,
Armature said, seeing us approach. "What happened?" I asked. Carmina was standing in shock, watching the steady movement of the Elder's lung.
We found him lying here,
Armature said. Scribe Damon looked up at us.
Someone planted a bomb in his power armor. As soon as it closed, this happened.
We then heard a cough, followed by a shallow, labored voice.
"There is a traitor in our midst."
The Elder gathered all the strength he could, speaking for all of us to hear.
"The Grand Paladins are dead. Someone sabotaged their suits, too. But that traitor didn't know that due to a battle injury, I had a steel shoulder blade put in. So now I can finish my last task."
The surgeon spoke up.
Elder, please, stop exerting yourself.
"I'm already dead," he said flatly. "We've been betrayed by one of our own. Hold me up to the terminal."
Again, the surgeon protested.
Sir, you mustn't move.
"Rangers, lift me."
We looked away from the Star Paladin's glare and carefully picked him up, supporting his haunches as much as we could to keep the wound closed. He began typing commands into the main terminal, then stared into an electronic eye as it scanned his retina. He blinked and the blue lights of the server room switched to red. A loudspeaker began sounding through the halls, replacing the droll of the siren.
Purist protocol engaged. Please evacuate the installation. Purist protocol engaged. Please evacuate the installation.
I'm guessing that means what I think it means.
The cylinder tower started shaking as the wiring inside of it began pulling away from the bright magenta glow. With each wire that separated, the glow faded until it was nothing but a clear crystal. The Master Spell Matrix then turned sideways, presenting a handle.
"Take it,"
the Elder said. Scribe Damon took hold of the handle and pulled it free of the tower. Carmina and I set him back down against the tower.
Elder, you can't be serious,
Armature pleaded.
"The castle is lost, son. They'll be breaking down our door any minute now. They cannot be allowed to take the things that are stored here, or the world will slip into an age much darker than this one. I just hope the reactor takes out as many of the bastards as possible. Guards! He called out to the Blue Guard, and within seconds, all 4 of them had galloped up to us. You will see that the spell matrix is transported safely to a new outpost. Yes, sir, the lead guard said. He then looked toward Carmina and I. Rangers, lead the way. With this last order given, the Elder slipped away.
The traitor must have been someone very close to have sabotaged their power armor. I can't even imagine getting into a suit and having it explode on my back like a grenade.
We all felt betrayed. This was a moment none of us ever hoped for. Abandoning the castle, destroying all the weapons and technology that was stored there, it was the greatest failure we'd ever suffered. But standing over the Elder's dead body, we knew he was right. The number 1 priority was that the guardianship survive, even as we were facing this heavy loss.
Come on, the Blue Guard Paladin said. We'll take the emergency lift in his office.
The rest of us pulled on our helmets and followed them. A data file had appeared on my heads-up display. It was the coordinates for one of the far distant outposts. I glanced toward Carmina as she looked back at me. She had gotten a set of coordinates too. Behind the Elder's desk, there was a bookcase that the Blue Guard pushed to the side. There was an elevator shaft which took us all the way up into the train depot. The Blue Guard Paladin looked at us. We'll probably have to fight our way through to get to an engine. Be ready. As soon as the door opened, we found dozens of great arrows scattered around the vehicle bay, many of them wearing stolen suits of our power armor. Suddenly, all of my rage started boiling to the top. As soon as the first one saw us, I launched a full salvo of microgrenades at him. We were all firing as much as we could. The Blue Guards covered us on the outside as we headed for a defense engine. One of the raiders in power armor got a lucky shot and sent a high-density round into the neck of one of the guards. The remaining guards loaded us on the engine, then boarded with us as we started rolling out of the depot. But before we can get away, an RPG struck the back of the engine, sending Star Paladin, Humor, and a second Blue Guard tumbling off of the side. They were surrounded and killed instantly. The locomotive rushed out of the train depot as more explosives rang out behind us.
How tragic.
The tracks ahead of us were clear, so we pushed forward, moving as fast as we could toward Outpost Beta. After 2 minutes, everything suddenly went quiet. Then we felt it. A pulse rippled through our bodies, which was followed by a bright green light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. We watched it in stunned silence as the mountain exploded like a volcano. The hot wind and noise washed over us. Castle Alpha was gone. Possibly thousands of us were dead. Half of the guardianship wiped away before our eyes. We could only hope, like the Elder had said, that we had destroyed most of the great arrows too.
How many trains had gotten away?
We didn't know. The track was empty ahead of us. It's possible some of them had taken a different route. They might have left for Outpost Gamma instead. Outpost Beta was about 30 minutes away, so we tried hailing them on the emergency frequency. But unfortunately, all we heard was static. We figured the explosion of the castle reactor was interfering with our signal, so we had to wait. Carmina and I were staring out of the rear window. The mushroom cloud rose into the sky. The last remains of our home had been swallowed up. Ash began raining down, bringing in a fresh nuclear winter. Scribe Damon had the spell matrix on his back. Armature and Fuel Rod were talking with him and one of the Blue Guards. The Blue Guard Paladin was driving the engine. Carmina was resting her head on my shoulder. We couldn't see the mushroom cloud anymore. We had passed over the horizon. But even then, we didn't want to turn around. We didn't want to face forward or join the rest of the group. I think deep down, we both knew what would happen next. It wasn't until Armature called out to us that we finally did turn to face reality. We walked forward to the front window of the defense engine where everyone else had gathered. A second mushroom cloud rose up into the sky. Purist protocol. Outpost Beta was gone too. The Great Arrows were able to infiltrate the castle, force their way down to the very bottom. Of course they were able to infiltrate it as well. Outpost Beta was 5 times smaller. They were probably all the same way.
What are we going to do now?
Armature said. But none of us answered. None of us knew what to say.
We should at least try for Outpost Delta,
Fuel Rod said.
We know the Great Arrows only have so many suits of Thunderhoof armor.
Scribe Damon snapped back at him. Well, we also knew that we had defeated them all together, and now look what's happened. Fuel Rod cowered down, feeling defeated. No, he's right, I said, trying to back him up. We need to at least try. If it's gone, then we'll go through Delta Pass and head toward Outpost Zeta. We cannot give up. Everything is depending on us now. The others agreed, and we kept moving, leaving a second mushroom cloud behind us.
Where did they all come from? They really do sound like a plague.
Like I said, they must have been planning the siege for a long time. TikTok had lulled us into a false sense of security. We thought we had won. We thought we had beat them. All of us were mobilizing as we began occupying Outpost Zeta, and as much as we tried to defend Thunder Valley, it was simply too big of an area. Between Castle Alpha and 5 outposts, there were only about 7,000 of us. The bases limited how large our population could be, and even though we were able to stretch that number by improving our facilities and having rangers out in the field, we could only do so much. Somehow, TikTok had convinced over 10,000 raiders to make the long journey down to Thunder Valley, deep in the southwest of Equestria. But even if he had sent 100,000, he wouldn't have been able to beat us. It took just one traitor to cause all of the guardianship to come crashing down.
How is that possible? For one pony to have access to entry codes is one thing, but then to sneak them all past the guards on the higher levels? Not to mention, this sounds like someone who must have a major grudge against all of you, who would willingly turn against his brothers and sisters, betray them all to an evil gang of vicious raiders.
It's kind of sad, isn't it? That it only takes one traitor to undo 200 years of faithful duty. Could you imagine if the Great War was the same way? It'd be like if someone had told the zebras how to build a balefire bomb. The rest of our journey felt like time had slowed down. It was a 3-hour trip to reach Outpost Delta, but it might as well have been a lifetime. This mission, the guardianship, meant everything to us. It was our sole duty in life. It was the reason our ancestors had survived the Great War. We had a righteous purpose. We were the stewards of these ancient vaults of pre-war technology. They were supposed to change the world, empower a new government to light the way and guide us out of this darkness. We were going to march in, ready to serve whoever the new princess or king or goddess might be. They would bring back the sun. They would rebuild civilization thanks to us. It felt like the end of the world all over again. Everyone we knew was gone. All of what we accomplished was destroyed. As far as we were concerned, we were already dead. As we entered the Lightning Storm region, we attached the Thunderhoof armor pieces. As we circled the mountain, we arrived at the crater that used to be Outpost Delta.
Even there, they had been overrun? Could it have been done on purpose? Is that something someone could have activated remotely from the castle?
Well, the Master Spell Matrix is a powerful device. It has many functions and controls it can be used for. It could have been used to melt down the 11 reactors it was connected to. But to me, it would seem like Elder Greycrest was generally hoping it could be installed at a different outpost. I don't know if he would have threatened the others without knowing the full situation, which none of us did. Plus, the Great Arrows didn't want to destroy our technology. They wanted to use it. Who knows what they could have done? When we saw the remains of Outpost Delta, we just kept moving along the track. We would continue on toward Outpost Zeta. Carmina and I would make the same expedition we had done only 4 months earlier. As soon as we reached Delta Pass, we found that the giant titanium doors were open, but not all the way. There was only about 6 feet of clearance between them, not enough for the defense engine to pass through. So a blue guard hopped off the train and walked toward the door controls. When he entered the booth, he pulled one of the control levers. Then, in a bright flash of orange, thermal explosives went off, destroying the entire control booth.
Oh, goddess.
Several RPGs crashed through the windows of the cabin. The blue guard Paladin didn't survive. Carmina had her sniper rifle with her and began finding targets through the windows of the engine. There were 5 of them. They were the last ones with Thunderhoof armor to protect them from the lightning. The fact that they were wearing the armor actually gave us an advantage. The arcs of lightning touched down frequently, being attracted to the metal.
That's perfect. It's literally a sign from the heavens.
The rest of us gave her covering fire as she killed the arrows hidden on the mountain ridges. After a minute, the shooting had stopped. When we thought that the coast was clear, we gathered in formation and slowly left the train looking for any last raiders that might be around us. We were almost through the door of Delta Pass when one final shot rang out. An armor-piercing bullet sailed through the air. It was a shot that was aimed for my head, but based on the angle, he missed. Instead, the bullet shot through my back right leg. When she heard the shot, Carmina aimed and killed the last great arrow that was hunting us. I stumbled backwards into the tunnel. My leg was killing me, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. I expected there to be shooting pain or something that would have me screaming instead of just gritting my teeth. I sat down in a puddle and started bitching about the pain. I hadn't been shot before. I mean, plenty of bullets had bounced off my armor, made dents, but none had broken through before. The bullet wound didn't bother me as much as I expected. It was probably the adrenaline. With all of the stress and chaos going on, we were all focused on the mission above all else. Regardless, my strong, beautiful fiancée stepped into caregiver mode.
Here, let me take a look at it,
Carmina said. Being the other ranger among us, she knew just as much about field dressing as I did.
Armature, can you shine your light here?
She said as she started unsnapping that armored section.
Can you believe it?
I asked, allowing myself to be distracted by the situation.
That last bastard was able to get a shot in.
At least it was only my leg.
Oh, goddess!
She cried as Armature brought his light around. I wasn't sitting in some pool of water that I collected near the train tracks. I was sitting in a pool of my own blood. As soon as she cut away my bodysuit, we all watched as a stream of blood shot out from my femoral artery.
That can be a quick death.
Moving as fast as she could, she pinched the artery long enough to seal it up with a special glue. She then started patching up the rest of the wound. I wasn't bleeding anymore, but I had lost a lot. I was leaning on her shoulder now as she continued to work.
It's going to be okay,
she said to me.
We'll get you some water and ration bars and you'll be good as new in a couple of days.
I tried to focus on her words, but everything was getting fuzzy. I could only sit there as she stitched me. Even through our helmets, I could smell the berry scent of her mane. I knew I was going to pass out soon. I could feel my eyes closing. But once again, I was awakened by a deafening sound. A siege gun fired, and when I looked up, Carmina's helmet was covered in blood.
Oh, no.
I felt her body shift, but not in the way I was expecting. She sat up taller and her siege gun was aiming forward.
It was you!
She yelled, her voice full of anger. I tilted my head, but my body was responding slowly. I followed where her gun was aiming. On the ground lay the dead body of Scribe Damon. The Master Spell Matrix was being pulled off of his back.
Fuel Rod, how could you?
Armature said.
Oh, son of a bitch.
Fuel Rod had Armature in a headlock. His gun was pointed at his temple.
You fucking monster! Let him go or I'll tear you to pieces!
Carmina continued to scream at him, but I was still slouched against her shoulder.
Why?
Armature asked.
We were your friends, your family.
Shut up! He yelled back.
You're not my friends. You, all of you, you killed my family.
I was watching all of this happen, but I could barely move. I couldn't react to any of it.
You filthy traitor!
Carmina yelled.
You're the traitors!
He yelled back, almost crying in a sniveling voice.
All of you turned against us. All of you betrayed us. My mother was going to do great things. She had a bright future. She had so many plans. She was going to take us all the way to outpost Zeta. But then you executed her.
No, you don't mean...
That's when we discovered that Fuel Rod was the only child of Elder Feathertail. At the end of everything, he was the last child that she had made an orphan, by her own misguided pride. And ever since then, he had been constructing this narrative in his mind that somehow we were the ones in the wrong, that we were the ones who had betrayed him. So he decided to walk in her footsteps, becoming an even worse traitor than she was. Evil to his very core. Fuel Rod was backing away from us, still keeping Armature clutched tight in his grasp. He pulled out some kind of transmitter from his saddlebag and gave one final statement.
Now the last of you pay for what you did. Now you die with the rest of them!
He kicked Armature toward us and clicked the button. In a series of booms, several explosives went off above us. They had been planted in the ceiling of the tunnel to collapse and block the door to Delta Pass. Once again, it felt like time had slowed down to a crawl. I looked up as several large boulders started falling down toward us. I felt my body turn as Carmina picked me up with her front legs. For a moment, it felt like a hug. Then her legs extended out and I tumbled away from her. I landed next to Armature, both of us stopped by Scribe Damon's dead body. Then I watched as the boulders came down, crushing Carmina beneath their weight. I slipped into unconsciousness after seeing the last light of my life be snuffed out.
Oh, you poor thing.
I don't know how long I was asleep. I think Armature had been knocked out by one of the boulders. I thought I had died. I wish I had died. But there I was, still breathing. My helmet had automatically switched to night vision mode. I was lying on my back, staring up at one of the metal support beams that didn't break from the explosions. It had bent and was weighed down, but otherwise it acted like a tent. It sent falling boulders in two different directions so that Armature and I were left alive in a pocket. I slowly sat up, but I was very dizzy. I felt like a ghost. All of my skin was numb. Without fully realizing it, I had amnesia. I had no idea what I was doing there or who I was. I looked around, trying to find my bearings. There were chunks of whitish stone that stacked up to the ceiling on both sides. Near the top of one of the piles was a unicorn in a metal suit. He was kicking the rock near the ceiling. It didn't look like he made any progress at all. When he noticed me stirring, he called down to me.
Sandstone? You're awake!
Sandstone? I thought to myself. This isn't sandstone. It's bedrock. If it were sandstone, this short unicorn would have been able to kick through it by now. He hopped down to the floor next to me. He pulled a few cubes of something out of his saddlebag.
Here, eat this,
he said.
You need to start replenishing all that lost blood.
What do you mean? I asked. I've got it all right here. Both of my hind legs were covered in dry blood, and at the time, my mind didn't recognize the difference.
Yikes. It sounds like you came pretty close to death. You didn't even have enough blood to think straight.
The reality of amnesia is that it leaves you with facts and basic knowledge, but it takes away your memories and experiences. I was able to talk perfectly fine, but I couldn't remember a single thing about my mother. I knew what bedrock was, but didn't recognize my own name. I knew that I had a fiancée, that I was getting married, but I couldn't remember who she was or what she looked like. It felt almost dreamlike. I was just going through the motions. This short gray unicorn kept going up to each side of the cave and would check on me every time I woke up. He'd ask me questions, then look distressed by the answers I gave him, and fed me another ration bar. There was a trickle of water coming in from one side of our cave. It was the side that faced north toward the outpost Zeta. The opening was barely large enough for a leg to pass through. It was enough room so air could circulate, but there's no telling how much oxygen was in there. The tunnel beyond that hole was a mile long, and we had no idea if the other blast doors were open or not. Finally, after many days had passed, I had gained back most of my strength, but I still couldn't remember much of anything.
How many days exactly had Scribe Damon started decomposing?
The body was lying in a far corner of the cave where Armature had moved him. Delta Pass had an elevation over 7,000 feet. It was always cold up there on the mountain, but it was also the winter time, making it that much colder. Armature and I kept wearing our power armor just to stay warm. Scribe Damon's body was already frozen. Armature had gone over to him several times. He emptied the ammo containers and saddlebags looking for anything useful. At one point, he was going to take off the helmet, see if there was anything useful to find on there. But then he hesitated, and left it alone. Most of the faceplate was gone. It had exploded outward from the exit wound. There's no way it worked anymore, so Armature pulled out the spark battery. Our suits kept us warm enough. Armature hadn't started a fire because that probably would have used up the last oxygen in the room. Instead, he illuminated things with the glow from his horn. I don't really know how much time had passed. I slipped in and out of consciousness every couple of hours. Even when I was awake, things seemed like a blur. Armature looked like he had run out of ideas. He was lying on the ground looking through my helmet. That's when he sat up. He pulled off the helmet, revealing a shaggy beard that had grown around his muzzle.
Sandstone,
he said.
Why didn't you mention that you had received outpost coordinates?
I looked back at him blankly, not understanding what he was saying.
Do you know what that means?
He asked, once again trying to jog my memory. Again, I just stared at him.
It means the locations of the other outposts were deleted from the Master Spell Matrix.
He allowed himself to smile, taking in any glimmer of good news he could hold on to. He looked at me again.
Don't you see? Elder Greycrest would only send those coordinates out if he deleted them. He knew the traitor might still be among us. The Great Arrows won't be able to find the other outposts now.
That is good news.
Armature was standing up now, relishing in the small victory.
Yes! That's what he gets. Hopefully TikTok will kill Fuel Rod when he realizes what happened.
At the mention of Fuel Rod's name, I felt my heart beat. It started beating faster and faster, like blood was returning to my brain for the first time. With every thump, another flood of memories poured back into me. Flashes of everything that had happened. The images seared back into my mind. They were overwhelming me, to the point where I started lashing out at them. I stood to my hooves, feeling every muscle tense in my body. "That murderer!" I cried. Armature stepped back surprised. "That fucking monster!" I screamed again. "He killed them all! He took her away from me!"
Sandstone, calm down.
Armature was trying to pacify me, recognizing how quickly all the memories had returned. I picked up the ammo containers. All of them. I loaded my siege gun with every micro grenade we had left. "I'll kill him!" I yelled out. I was echoing those last moments of Carmina's life, suddenly filled with new purpose, new determination. I aimed upward toward the small opening.
Sandstone, no!
Armature cried out, trying to stop me. But I didn't listen. I fired every micro grenade at the opening. The explosions rang out. Shell fragments poured down the boulders, like sand in an hourglass, until finally the explosion stopped. Click, 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 click. I kept pulling the trigger, hoping that somehow more grenades would appear. Click, 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 click. But through my visor, I watched in disbelief when the smoke cleared. Nothing had changed. The opening was still barely large enough for a leg to fit through.
How could that be? How many times did you fire?
I don't know, really. At least 24 times. But even if I had another 24, it wouldn't have made a difference. Even a rocket launcher might not have helped. All of those were good at causing a concussion, a blast of air and heat. They did a great deal of damage to organic creatures. They could even shred power armor or tilt a moving train. But I wasn't shooting at any of those things. The large chunks of bedrock were unfazed by my assault. Anything less than thermal explosives wasn't going to do the trick. The intense heat generated by them creates a great deal of pressure in a very small location. It would take a shock like that to fracture the bedrock and hopefully dislodge a piece so that we could crawl our way through. I was still standing there, clicking the trigger. Damn it, no! Damn it! The images continued to burn in my mind. I had no place to take out my rage or frustration. All I saw was Carmina getting crushed beneath the boulder, over and over again. That's when Armature walked up next to me, and suddenly I had someone to scream at. Some small place that I could vent my anger. Damn it, Armature! How could you let him get a hold of you? Why couldn't you fight him off? What? Armature stood back in confusion. Why didn't you try pulling your gun on him? Why do you have to be so fucking weak? If you could have at least moved away from him, Carmina could have taken the shot. She would still be alive. You don't mean what you're saying, he said calmly. Everything's hitting you all at once. You're just upset. It was how calmly he said it that enraged me the most. I'll show you upset! I yelled at him. Then with all my strength, I threw my helmet, which struck him right between the eyes. The light of his horn disappeared. The force of the throw relieved a lot of the anger. After breathing out, I asked him, Are you okay? After a pause, he answered, Did you have to throw it so hard? I'm sorry, I said. I just feel so useless. I know, he said back. So do I. We sat there silently for a long time, neither one of us getting up. Now that my memory had returned, I realized that I was getting hungry. How much food do we have left? I asked him. I gave you the last bar a few days ago, he answered. At least we have water. We had that small trickle of water coming into the cave. Plus our suits had water purifiers which could recycle our urine. We just have to wait, he said. Wait for what? I asked him. The next earthquake.
Oh, that's right. An earthquake every couple of weeks.
There was no telling exactly when the next one would happen, but Armature seemed happy to be talking to me again. As a Sandstone, he knew. Given the fact that 5 or 6 reactors went critical, I'm guessing the next quake will be a big one. That should be enough force to shift some of these boulders, and we should be able to crawl out. Or they could just crush us to death, I said back to him. Why does it even matter? The guardianship is destroyed. We might as well shoot ourselves. Don't say that! He yelled back to me, insulted that I was even thinking it. What would Carmina say? She wouldn't say anything, I yelled back at him. She's dead! And do you think suicide is the answer? Armature said back to me. Because that sounds like something the Great Arrows would do. They're about to lose a battle, so they swallow down a cyanide pill. Tears started running down my cheeks. We've lost everything. I swallowed a lump in my throat. I miss her so much. 2 more weeks passed, and neither of us had eaten anything. I could feel my strength fading away.
How long can you survive without eating?
About 3 weeks. Maybe a month if you're lucky. But neither of us were lucky. And I had lost so much blood from the bullet wound that I had still never fully recovered. What are we going to do? I asked Armature. I'm so hungry. I'll be dead in a few days anyway. I'd rather die from a bullet than starve to death.
You know,
Armature said,
there is still one thing left to eat.
It took me a minute to process what he was saying. But when I did, I stood up in shock. You can't be serious, I yelled back at him. Now who's sounding like a raider? On the far corner of the cave, Scribe Damon's frozen body was still sitting there, mostly preserved. Feeling dizzy from the exertion, I sat back down.
We have to at least consider it,
Armature said.
It could give us enough time to make it. What if the earthquake finally does happen, but we're too weak to crawl out?
A decision like that definitely can't be made lightly.
I couldn't believe what Armature was saying. He couldn't be serious. But he was. And he had a point. Every hour that passed, the idea was becoming more tempting.
You have the coordinates for an outpost, Armature reminded me. It might not be much, but if we can survive this, we can travel to it. We could see if there's a way to contact any of the others. We could see if anyone else got away from the explosions.
Armature's words were gnawing on my brain, until they finally got through to me. I crawled my way to the other side of the cave, to the unmoving suit of power armor that still sat there. I stared at it for a long time. It was lying in a heap, at a strange angle. The suit was covered in a thin layer of frost. I kneeled down and unscrewed one of the armor pieces. I pulled it away and saw his mark staring up at me. It was the image of a scroll. A real scroll, made out of parchment and wood. It only reminded me of the spell matrix, of the guardianship. The scroll that governed our bylaws and morality did not mention anything about cannibalism, one way or another. But even if it had, how much of the guardianship was left? Would any of them even care or judge me? The only voice I heard was Armature's.
We need to survive. Carmina gave her life to save you. If we die, that sacrifice meant nothing.
I pulled out my combat knife. I was reminded about how much leather barding I had to cut away from the Great Arrow corpses. I'm sorry, I whispered. Then I lowered the knife and, with a breath, pushed down into the icy flesh. I moved the serrated edge, cutting around his mark on 3 sides. I pulled the skin away, revealing the soft flesh of his flank. I cut out a small piece and held it for a moment. Not sure if I can go through with it. I heard Armature's voice again.
We have to survive.
Then I bit down into the flesh.
I almost hate to ask, but what did it taste like?
It didn't taste like much of anything. Just cold meat. A small thought did cross my mind to pull out one of the hot sauce bottles, but I pushed it aside. There was no way I could dress it up or try to pretend that I wasn't eating one of my own. My strength slowly began to return, but I felt even worse inside than I did before.
How much longer were you stuck there?
Another 2 weeks. I don't even remember how much I had to eat. I tried to make it as little as possible, but by the end I had removed almost half his armor. I was just sitting there against one of the walls when I finally felt the ground begin to shake. It was a big one, just like Armature had said. I pulled my helmet back on as walls started to rumble, The sound of stones cracking and breaking surrounded me as I watched for any falling rocks above me. In the middle of the chaos, I felt a rush of wind. I turned on my heads-up display. For the last month, I had left my suit in low power mode so it could keep me warm. When the dust had settled, a large opening had fallen away leading out into the Delta Pass tunnel. It was large enough for both of us to walk right through. "Ha ha!" I cried, filled with a rush of excitement. "We made it!" I said. "I can't believe we made it!" But Armature didn't answer me. "Armature?" I said. "Are you okay?" As soon as the words left my mouth, I had a feeling of déjà vu. Then I started to feel my heart beat again. It was just like when my memories had returned. I switched my visor to night vision mode and walked up to him. Armature was lying on his side, his helmet sitting next to him. Next to his head was a pool of dried blood. A large wound was visible, right between his eyes and right below his horn.
Do you mean?
Oh, goddess, no.
Armature was dead. When I threw my helmet at his head, he had died from the impact. For over a month, I'd been talking to a corpse. The body of my best friend, who I had killed in a moment of anger and pain. I was so delusional that I had recreated him as a figment of my imagination. The voice of my subconscious, manifesting itself as a ghost to speak to me.
I am so sorry.
So all of that time, the conversations, running out of food, your decision, it was all you talking to yourself?
My mind had finally fractured. I had grown up, spent most of my life in a certain amount of pain. Most of my drive to fight the Great Arrows was rooted in the loss I felt from the death of my mother. It was only because of Carmina and Armature, my new family, that I was able to carry on. During that pause, that last silence where I asked Armature if he was okay, my mind refused to accept his death, so instead I heard his voice.
That's awful.
What did you do then?
I wept. I sat beside him and wept for a long time. By the end of it all, only one thought crossed my mind. Justice. Fuel Rod was still out there, still living and breathing, and I knew I could not stop until I put him in the ground, make him suffer for the thousands of lives he had destroyed. I buried Damon and Armature there in the cave, right next to the boulder where Carmina had been buried. Once I had put them to rest, I walked through Delta Pass and found myself at the second set of blast doors. Just like the other ones, they had been partially opened. 6 feet, enough for a suit of armor to pass through, but small enough that none of the trains could use it. Next to the blast doors, the control stations had been destroyed. Thermal explosives, just like the other ones. As soon as I stepped outside, a bolt of lightning struck my armor, giving a small charge to the spark battery. I had all 3 batteries now, Damon's, Armature's, and my own. I followed the railroad tracks down the mountains, eventually coming to Prairie Springs, the town we had captured barely 6 months ago. The town had been ransacked. Decomposing bodies littered the streets. The Great Arrows had attacked there as well. I walked into the 2-story building that I had taken during the siege. There was still a large hole at the top of the staircase. I looked up toward the cliff, hoping that, somehow, I would see Carmina standing there. But it was empty. The town was empty. The valley was empty. The salt plateau was empty.
I was the only one left alive. Nothing to keep me company but an eerie silence in the air. Any arrows that might have survived the reactor explosions had left the valley. There was no reason to stay anymore, and there was no reason for me either. In the center of town, 2 defense engines were still sitting in the station. I got into one of them and was surprised that the spark battery still had any life to it. The train started moving and I left the town. After a few hours, I passed by outpost Zeta. It was the quest I had worked toward most of my life, and now it was only a crater with a small green glow in the center. I took the train north, over the salt plateau, and rode it for as long as it would take me. Once the battery died, I continued on foot, slowly moving toward the coordinates that blinked in my helmet. With my ranger training, I was able to survive everything the wasteland threw at me, until eventually discovering Outpost Sigma, which is not far from here. I crossed the entire continent to get here, but I really wasn't surprised when I found the outpost empty.
So that's how you ended up here, so far away from Thunder Valley.
Over the last 20 years, I've used it as a base of operations. I've gone on several quests and journeys all over the wasteland, killing any great arrows that I find.
Good. Fuck those guys.
I've looked for any information I can and done my best to track down TikTok or Fuel Rod, but they've disappeared, and I haven't heard anything about them in years.
So you've come here to ask for help?
The great arrows are a menace, a disease that destroy everything they touch. If there's anyone out there that has any information about TikTok or Fuel Rod, please help me. They're a menace, and I'm sure most of you hate them too. If you can help me at all, I swear by the heavens that I'll bring justice down upon them. And if Fuel Rod is listening, you sniveling, pathetic coward, why don't you come out and face me like a stallion? I'm not going to stop until you pay for what you did to all of us. I will avenge Carmina if it's my last dying breath.
So what happens if you do? Where do things go from there?
Honestly, I don't know. If I kill Fuel Rod, I would maybe continue to find TikTok. But I haven't heard about him in years. I'm pretty sure he's already been killed and replaced by some other leader. Plus, there's still one last debt that needs to be paid. No matter what they did, I'm the one who killed Armature. But in the end, I don't know what's worse. Is it better that I die? That I kill myself to pay the price? Or is it better that I live and continue to suffer with the knowledge of what I've done?
I guess we can't answer that for you. But one thing I do know for sure is that in the meantime, you're always welcome to be with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That does mean a lot to me.
And if we do find out any information about Fuel Rod or TikTok, we will pass the message along to you.
I'll keep my ear to the ground also. I travel quite a bit myself, so I'll ask around as I try to find out more about the Red Reaper.
I guess all I can do now is thank you for joining us. It was very moving to hear your story. I do hope it works out for the best in the end. Please know that you are always welcome to return whenever you want.
I appreciate it. Hopefully next time, I'll have a better story to tell.
Then thank you once again for joining us, Paladin Sandstone. And thank all of you out there in Post-Apocalyptia for staying with us for another episode of Confessions of a Wasteland Pony.
Every story must come to an end. I wish I could tell you more. We've had our sadness and we've had our fun, something we can't ignore. And though we may fly to the east and the west, and distance may keep us apart.